You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, events, politics, and more from across our divided country and the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope your mornings are going well. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 650 new coronavirus deaths and 55,621 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 54,190 cases per day. That is a decrease of 8% from the average 2 weeks earlier. So yesterday, less than 500 deaths, 400-something deaths counted, and 30-something thousand cases. Those were both, at least relative to recent months, very low numbers. Today picked up again slightly, but still down. And like I just mentioned, down 8% from the average just a couple weeks ago. So we seem to be going down even further yet. Let's keep that train rolling in that direction. As of this morning, more than 29,898,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 542,000 have died from it. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Monday that he plans to get vaccinated against the coronavirus this week. Putin didn't specify which vaccine he would take. Russian authorities have approved 3 domestically developed shots: Sputnik V, Epivac Corona, and Covivac. Police deployed water cannon and pepper spray after a gathering of some 20,000 protesters against lockdown and other coronavirus rules in central Germany turned violent. Germany has just announced that it will be extending its lockdown for 3 weeks. In national news, White House coordinator for the southern border, Roberta Jacobson, and the National Security Council senior director for the Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez, will travel to Mexico Monday and Guatemala later this week. The trip comes as migrant crossings of the southern U.S. border are increasing, with nearly 100,000 migrants detained at the border in February. Big problem, and we're going to be coming back to this at least 1 and probably 2 points later on in the show. Definitely talking about this from 9:15 to 9:45 with Joel Siegel, and very likely talking about this. We talk with Ted Rall later on in the show at 8:15. And this is the Biden administration's current big problem. Just remember, Jamarl, just a month ago, what was their problem? It was passing the COVID bill. Well, you know, the seasons change. The weather lightens up slightly, and apparently now the arbitrary detainment of thousands at the southern border, after Biden called for them to come to the United States, is now the new problem du jour.
Well, he didn't technically call for him to come to the United States. That's not fair. When did Biden call for people to come to the U.S.?
Well, he reversed it. He was very clear during the primaries that he wanted to reverse Trump's policies of pushing them away. And so he wanted to have a more welcome home for people, which, again, I'm not even necessarily opposed to that. I'll be honest. If we're going to keep doing the coup thing, the least we can do is take them in. But we should stop doing the coup thing. And when we stop doing the coup thing, we should figure out, okay, what could we do to build these other countries back up? Or is there some sort of I don't know exactly what this looks like, but is there some sort of global national reparations thing where, at least in terms of nation building and providing high level economic support and advice, like genuine advice, not advice on strings, but to these countries, who admittedly many of whom would not want our advice. But you get what I'm saying. I guess my point is, I don't know exactly where I stand on it, but Biden specifically did seem to take a much more friendly tact. And at the same time, shortly after he did that, he's now telling them, do not come, or at least Mayorkas is saying that adamantly. What do you mean, Jamarl?
I don't think Biden explicitly told them to come. And I would go further. That typical Democratic policy was never really that different all that much from Trump, with the exception of a few, caveats here and maybe a little bit more angry and meanness. If you go back and listen to some of the things that Democrats were saying, Obama, Clinton, if I'm not mistaken, even Biden were talking about the wall, or for that matter, somewhat of a hostile environment so people wouldn't necessarily come here. The catch with Biden and with Trump is that Trump stretched the political space regarding this issue to such a degree that anybody else coming behind him, by definition, looks inviting. Does that make sense? Also, Biden did something else. Biden got rid of the provision, meaning when kids are brought here, if they're unaccompanied, we take them in. And that's where Biden screwed up. Now, for better or for worse, like you said, the coups and everything else, you have the drug laws for that. I mean, that goes beyond the coups. Just know our drug policy in the United States. We are a huge, huge importer of drugs. We have a lot of people who are doing cocaine. We have a lot of people who are doing things that are injuring them and everything else. Often, many of those things are because of the societal issue. But either way, for whatever reason, they're coming from South America. 60% or 80% of the drugs going through Honduras, for example. So it's like we are, and then we have our police force or drug forces going to those countries, creating wars and whatnot. So like, it's all of those things. But I guess my point is, if you're going to change the policy that allows kids to stay here, regardless of your reasoning could be the most humane in the world. You're still stuck with the consequences of that humane action, in which case people are going to bring their kids to the border for a better life. That's what they did. So, yeah, in one case, you can say Biden is guilty of it. Yes, agreed. But is that inviting? I think that's different. But fair enough. That's quibbling over a word. I think you were being hyperbolic, but I'm not going to hit you on it too hard.
You did. You did, though. No, but it's okay. If you see me pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable to say, at least in your opinion, please do hit me on it. But I think you get where I'm going. Biden courted the idea that he would swing the pendulum in the other direction from Trump. And Trump was, if anything, the anti-immigrant president. In addition to a couple of other things, but that was one of the things he was most known for. And I guess part of where I'm getting this is, why did all of the migrants come up if they didn't get a sense that Biden would act differently? And didn't he encourage that message? Was that just me? Was that just them? Because even if he didn't say so, if it's implied, that where does the plausible deniability fade as a statesman when all politicians are more or less vague on giving people promises? But he said words that encouraged them.
It's domestic policy on some level. I mean, these guys were pushing against Trump.
Though?
And let's be honest, there are some Democrats that are full for open borders. There's some that are. The majority aren't.
And there are like no Republicans.
None.
I'd have to check on
none.
I'd have to check with Rand Paul, who's obviously a libertarian, but I'm pretty sure he's a no. I'm pretty sure last I checked, he was a no. Libertarians are a little bit weird like that sometimes. But I guess my point is, I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's definitely a tonal shift, totally. And from a domestic policy standpoint, the Democrats did take this tact of Trump is horrible to immigrants. Trump is horrible to immigrants. By definition, if he's horrible, we're going to be the ones that aren't. Not to mention, if you look at Sanders with the Hispanic vote and Democrats trying to fight for the Hispanic vote, and some of the things that they might have been saying, meaning they were far more amenable to listen to that conversation when it was necessary to win. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from with that. I don't know if that's an enunciation of the borders open coming in, but yeah, it's definitely a tonal shift.
I want to come back to this. Just not horrible on immigrants would be a great sales pitch. That would be like a good plank for the Democratic Party. Not horrible on immigrants.
We're not
terrible on social policy. More or less kind to women, that kind of thing. That would be a good middle of the road, campaign stump column for a sales pitch for the Democratic Party. Anyway, back to the headlines here, continuing the conversation on migrants. New photos from an overflow facility in Texas showed crowded conditions for migrants over the weekend amid an increase in the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border. An aide for Rep. Henry Quiller said each of the 8 pods in the facility has a 260-person capacity. But as of Sunday, one pod held more than 400 unaccompanied male minors. Miller believes that the conditions are terrible for the migrant children, and though the agents were doing the best they can under the circumstances, they are not equipped to care for children and need help from the Biden administration. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday defended the Biden administration's handling of the new surge of unaccompanied minors at the border, saying that the American people will, quote, look back on this and say that we secured the border and we upheld our values, end quote. Okay, or not, or not, or they won't look back kindly on you at all. And both parties will criticize you severely, each in their own way, which seems to be what this is setting them up for. History is often remembered by how different series of events end. So maybe they managed to fix this one way or another. But right now, this is definitely not a cause for celebration by either party. Anyway.
And one last thing that we need to point out. This is how cynical and vicious politics is. Because from this political standpoint, they look at it as if it's factors on the ground to be manipulated for political effect, be it propaganda effect or, political one-upsmanship. The pain of those people in those camps or laying in those blankets, those children who are crying, those are actual real people. And that pain is being leveraged for political expedience. That is horrendous. AOC is not crying at the border right now. The Republicans now all of a sudden care about the border when beforehand they didn't. Democrats don't want to talk about it. Yeah.
Speech is revealing. When your first focus is how it's going to be perceived, when it's on this sort of second order effect, not whether what you're doing is right, but whether it will be perceived as right or correct or the due course of action, you can look at somebody's speech, and I don't want to read too much into it, but it can reveal what they're thinking. Mayorkas again said that the American people will, quote, look back on this and say that we secured the border and we upheld our values, end quote. Again, look back on this and say. The whole situation is viewed from the other party's perspective. He is thinking of it like a politician, at least if I read into that speech. And I would a little bit. And that's sadly, again, it follows along with the political games that we play in the United States. But it's not a good vantage to be viewing yourself from. You should just be looking at whether what you're doing is right or morally appropriate, and that's how you actually lead the country. Anyway, back to the headlines. Enough soliloquizing. Former President Donald Trump on Monday said that he expected President Biden's fall on the steps of Air Force One, and that he also believes Biden's mental state may be diminished to the point that he may not understand what he's signing, opening the door to Kamala Harris replacing him. He also announced Monday he is endorsing GOP Congressman Jody Hice of Georgia in his campaign to unseat the state's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Hice, who represents Georgia's 10th Congressional District, announced Monday he would run for Secretary of State and claimed Raffensperger created, quote, cracks in the integrity of our elections, end quote. Hice is a defender of Trump and echoed the former president's accusations of election fraud. Before we move on, Jamarl, we're late on headlines, but we can come back to them later on in the show. Real quick. The Air Force One incident. I'm guessing you've seen this. We didn't talk about it yesterday. What are your thoughts on it?
Him falling down the steps?
Yes, exactly.
An old man falls down the steps?
Because that has been made a big it's been put into the limelight by the Republicans. And in case you're one of the few people on the surface of this country who haven't seen that video, basically Biden is walking out to Air Force One, and then as he starts to go up the steps to the plane, he gets a couple steps into it, and then he stumbles, and he stumbles again on the next step, and then he stumbles again on the next step, and falls to one knee and uses his hand to brace himself, which is on the one hand absolutely nothing. He is a human being after all. On the other hand, he is closer to 80 than to 70, and the Democrats put out the note that basically there was heavy wind on the scene. But I don't know, man. A lot of folks have been making a lot out of this. I'll put it like this. I saw this. My brother came to me and was like, dude, have you seen this video from, on Friday, not too long after it had happened? And I watched it, and I just felt pity for the poor guy. But it's worth talking about because a lot of other people are talking about it. At least briefly, I bring it up. Anyway, back to the headlines here. South Dakota's GOP Governor Kristi Noem declined on Friday to sign a bill from legislators that would have banned transgender girls from participating in women's high school sports. In Colorado, a gunman opened fire inside a supermarket Monday, killing 10 people, including a police officer. Many of the details surrounding the shooting remain unclear. In international news, Iran has made threats against Fort McNair, an army post in the U.S. Capitol, and against the Army's vice chief of staff. That's according to two senior U.S. intelligence officials, at least. The intelligence also revealed purportedly threats to kill Jennifer Joseph M. Martin and plans to infiltrate and surveil the installation. Threats are one reason the Army has been pushing for more security around Fort McNair, which sits alongside Washington's newly developed waterfront district. The European Union...
There's one more part of that. They said they were going to take Jerry Seinfeld hostage and kick Bugs Bunny on their way up. They said that. That was part of it. The right? Intelligence officials, they know it. It's firm. They know it as a flat fact, Shane. They know it's a flat fact. They're going to take Bugs Bunny hostage. Man.
He's wily. If you take Bugs Bunny hostage, if you ever watch the cartoons, he tends to get out of it.
Like, I was trying to think of something ludicrous.
Female bunny or something.
Because this is basically like they used to say with Saddam. It's like there's a dossier that says Saddam is ready to release chemical weapons. Saddam is ready to release nuclear weapons. Iran is about to attack at any moment. Like anonymous sources saying that they're reports. What are those reports? We can't see those reports. Well, how do we know who's saying that? That's anybody. It could write a report.
I hear you, but here's another take on this. I don't know, man. Didn't we also assassinate one of their top generals last January?
That's the other part.
And weren't we kind of on the same team that's assassinated other leaders, including unrelated scientific bureaucratic leaders like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was a nuclear scientist from what's been reported about him more widely by the West? Don't we do that stuff? I don't like any of this, but it seems like we're the ones who continuously instigate these conflicts. Anyway, we should come back to this later. We're running out of time, and I want to make sure we get these next two brief headlines in. The European Union, Britain, Canada, and the United States on Monday launched coordinated sanctions against officials in China over alleged human rights abuses. This comes after Secretary of State for the United States, Antony Blinken's meeting with top Chinese diplomat in Alaska over the weekend. That did not go well. We talked about that briefly yesterday. We'll be talking about that again today. In response, both Russia and China, through Russia's foreign envoy Sergei Lavrov and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, both of the countries have denounced the latest batches of sanctions, calling them interference. Specifically, Lavrov was in Beijing speaking with his counterpart. Lavrov also said that relations between the EU and Russia had been destroyed unilaterally by decisions made in Brussels, saying that Russia no longer had relations with the EU after Brussels destroyed them, but that Russia would be willing to come back to the table with the EU if and when the bloc is ready to remove this anomaly in relations. Big foreign, big geopolitical movements, sort of tectonic shifts in who's talking to whom and what, different countries think of each other. We're going to see all this stuff play out. I'm telling you. We need to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment and Jamarl's monologue.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join into this conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Let's get into it. I am more and more convinced that the dumbest people available in newsrooms are sent to these press briefings by the White House, and even on some level by the State Department, but definitely by the White House. I've been watching these things long enough to see how these guys operate, and it's almost like they're failing on purpose. Like there's an agreement that was made somewhere along the way with the State Department that says, look, the people who you're going to send to those press briefings, they need to be C students. All right, great. And even when they do get on the trail of something, their American perspective prevents them from actually seeing it. Now, when I always say that, they are doing this on purpose on some level, Shane would be like, no, Jamarl, you can't just assume that they're not incompetent. So fair enough. I would say that they have a perspective of the world that creates a blind spot, that even when they're sniffing at the edges of something, they still can't bring themselves to see it. Jen Psaki gets trapped in a logic trap. She doesn't understand or doesn't even notice she's trapped in it. And the reporter who's asking the question, he's confused. He knows there's something there. He knows something should be, something is strange in this. Something is odd. What he's missing is that American foreign policy is about American self-interest. And if they need to say that China is committing genocide, they will say that for American foreign policy interests, whether it's true or not. They would find a random guy that's promoting a random idea, and they would promote that random idea, and they would say it, and the media will report it just because the United States is saying it. The reality of it matters less. That's what he's missing. That's what he doesn't understand, because what she is saying doesn't make sense in the context of the previous question. First, let's go to this. Chinese diplomat Yang Yishi annihilates Blinken, making the point to him that I don't know who you think you're talking to, but China is not going to take a lesson from you. You are not the person who is basically, you have no standing to tell us and to set the conversation of dialogue. Let's play that clip because this is pretty brutal.
We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability.
倒打一把是不行的。
Well, you can't blame this problem on somebody else.
I have to tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described. I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
我们把你们想得太好了，我们认为你们会遵守基本的外交礼节。
Well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought that the U.S. side will follow the necessary diplomatic protocols.
所以我们刚才必须阐明我们的立场。
So for China, it was necessary that we make our position clear.
我现在讲一句，你们没有资格在中国的面前说你们从实力的地位出发同中国谈话。
So let me say here that in front of the Chinese side, the United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of
strength. No, it doesn't. I mean, China could bring up the number of people that are in our prisons. What, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the people in our prisons? What is the U.S. perspective on that? We say those are areas to which the people are going to be rehabilitated. Now, We know the recidivism rate shows that that's not really true. We know men get raped in prison all the time, and we know that little is done about it. Does that look like internment camps? Does it look like areas to which the United States is a sore thumb? I guess I'm making the point that we're looking at what they're doing over there, and we are again dropping the context of ourselves. And maybe that's not the best example, to be fair. So fair enough. I'm going to take that off the table. But let's keep going. Jen Psaki is asked the question on this very specific point of China and the conversation that the United States had with China. Let's play the clip.
Well, we expected tough and direct talks with the PRC on a wide range of issues, and that's exactly what happened. And I know there's been a lot of focus on some of the public theatrics or more dramatic public piece. But I can assure you from talking to our national security team that it was a substantive meeting. It was a 2-day meeting. They covered a range of issues from our concerns about human rights abuses to aggression in Hong Kong, Taiwan, our concerns there, our concerns about economic and intellectual property. And we also, of course, talk about ways we can work together. So we're taking stock of where we are. This is where we are now. I expect the president will certainly be talking with his national security team. Well, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State.
So basically, she's saying, the reporter basically asked her, did you get what you want out of those communications with China? She basically said that, look, we work together in areas that we can work together. We're going to work together. We talked about ways that we can work together, even though we have divisions in regards to the way we're engaging. Fair enough. That question seems entirely innocent. Let's go to the next one. Did the president, will there be more sanctions? Meaning Europe and all of these other countries in the United States file sanctions. Let's play this clip.
And what next steps do you think? China has retaliated against the EU. Do you expect U.S. retaliation? And is there any more sanctions that you would do if they don't act to change course with respect to the treatment of these minority groups?
Well, on the first question, I'm not aware of any linkage or plans to pull that back. Obviously, this was a reaction to what we felt were serious human rights abuses. Obviously, the Europeans felt this as well against members of Xinjiang's ethnic and religious minority groups. And no meeting would change our concerns related to that. And we took action, as you noted, in unity with the United Kingdom, Canada, and the European Union, who also acted against human rights abusers in connection with these atrocities. This demonstrates our ongoing commitment to work multilaterally to advance respect for human rights. And we continue to have grave concerns about China's crimes against humanity and genocide on Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But I don't have anything to predict for you on future sanctions. Obviously, this is an issue that was raised in this meeting last week and was an issue that was raised by the president.
All right, let's stop here for the moment. The reporter asked her, are you going to, did you get what you want out of China? Well, we're going to work together in the areas we can work together. Next question. Will there be more sanctions? Psaki. Well, the president took action because their Chinese are committing genocide. So wait a minute. You're working with a country that is actively committing genocide? China is a third number in our trading relationship with China, meaning they're our third largest trading partner. And we are trading with a country that is committing genocide to that extent. And even now, you're still talking about working together with a country that is actively doing genocide? That is shocking. The reporter is confused by this because, again, we're actively working with a country that you're saying is committing genocide. Now, just so we're clear, foreign policy makes the point that the State Department lawyers concluded there was insufficient evidence to prove genocide in China. But let's put that to the side for the moment. Let's keep going to the next clip. The reporter is confused. He knows there's something problematic with that statement. He knows that that's a conflict. Wait a minute. You're working with that country? They're committing genocide. They're killing the Uyghurs, according to you. Let's play the clip.
What will the U.S. do, if anything, if China doesn't change its approach? Is this sort of a one-stop sanction, or
1 minute.
Will this be revisited and are further sanctions possible? I mean, they've given no indication that they would change approach. In fact, they have more or less doubled down that they're doing nothing wrong with respect to these minority groups.
Well, clearly sanctions are meant to deter behavior, but I'm not going to rule in or rule out any actions when we're...
Okay, let's stop here for a moment because we're getting short on time. Basically, there's nothing else. One-stop sanctions for genocide. The reporter is confused by it because what the reporter doesn't quite get is it's bogus. Reuters is making the point that there are about 1 million Uyghurs. We killed more than that. Clinton, 500,000. Bush, 1 million. Libya, tens of thousands. Syria, 500,000. Iran, tens of thousands with the sanctions. Yemen, tens of thousands with the sanctions. Most of those wars starting in March. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for a really interesting conversation on what has been taking place between China and the United States. There was the belief, at the very least, people hated the bellicosity of Donald Trump towards China. He's so belligerent. He attacks China. However, there's a consistency in foreign policy from one president to the next. And that has remained true from the United States perspective on China. Joe Biden may not be as bellicose in the open. By the same token, the policies and the things that Lincoln has been saying has been astonishing. They basically said that China is responsible for genocide. One of the interesting things that have happened yesterday, I think we pointed out on the show today, that China seems to be pointing out to America that we are no longer going to take a lesson from you. And this seems to be a backbone where China has started to see themselves as being another dominant force in the world and not just somebody to take orders, or for that matter, a lesson from America. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Elijah Maguire, veteran war correspondent, who you can find his reporting at elijahjm.wordpress.com. Elijah, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. And am I pronouncing that last name correctly? I want to make sure I get it right. Is it Maguire?
Yes, that is correct.
Nailed it. Excellent. I'm horrible with names, so when I nail it, I like to point it out that I nailed it. So the relationship between China and the United States is very strange. China, for the longest time, has been at the whim of Western influence, and this has been something that has been very clearly known at this point by anybody that cared to have any interest in Chinese perspective of world politics. And this goes back to the Opium Wars, where the opium was basically forced into Chinese shores, the ripping away of Hong Kong. And for that matter, poverty. Well, you have a situation where China has basically pulled, 30, 40 million people out of poverty over the course of 20 years. These guys have pulled themselves into a world power. From the standpoint of technology, they are literally talking about putting a satellite on the moon or around it with Russia. They're a world player. And as such, they're no longer taking a lesson from the United States, or at the very least, taking a back seat. This was shown in a back and forth between a U.S. diplomat to the face of Anthony Blinken. And honestly, I have to say, as an American who has watched this, it's about time. What's your perspective of this? How do you see this? Am I, I'm trying to nail the Chinese perspective of this on some level to try to get across that they are tired of taking a lesson, or at the very least taking a back seat from the U.S. And this is one of those cases where it seems to be very clear in the open on national stage. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think China said it very clearly and put the whole answer in one sentence. The U.S. has no qualification to speak to China from a position of strength. And that really explains everything. Now, if we look at the reality, the United States is the superpower, the strongest country in the world. But here we're talking about the military strength. And if we look at what the military strengths offered to the United States, we look at we don't want to go very far. Let's go only to Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and then Syria, and then the sanctions on Iran. And we saw that the hundreds of military bases around the world, the thousands of nuclear bombs, the 2,000 jets, the 11 carrier on nuclear bases. So all that did not bring any victory to the United States. While if we look at China, China is investing not on building nuclear capacity and nuclear bombs, but in building the Silk Road, in offering the 5G, in offering technology, in going around the world and saying, hey, I don't want your money. I can construct and be in charge of the infrastructure of, they go to Iraq and they say, give us your oil. We don't pay for it and you don't pay us, but we give you the electricity. We build your road. We build your communication system. We build school and university. We build hospitals. This is what China is doing. And that is much more powerful than going with all the almighty war on countries and destroying countries like Iraq and leaving hundreds of thousands of people dead and hundreds of thousands of families who hate the Americans, and going to Syria and imposing sanctions on Syria, starving the population, stealing the oil, and creating, again, millions of people hating the Americans. Going to Lebanon, imposing sanctions, going to Iran since 1979, imposing sanctions. This is what the Americans are collecting. They have the almighty power, the military power, but they've got nothing. They have no friends, they have no allies, they're not offering anything to the future generations, they're not offering technology, they're using the technology they have, which is the most powerful and the strongest, only to destroy other nations, to starve population. Look at Yemen. This is what China is saying. You're no longer in a position of strength, because the strength here is not the military. The strength is, what are you offering to the future generation around the globe?
One of the things I'm sure that was on their mind, Yang Jiechi meeting with Secretary of State for the United States, Antony Blinken, it was just a few short months ago that Blinken signed on to the former Secretary of State Pompeo's proclamation that China was guilty of committing genocide. Again, just a few months ago at this point, still in recent memory, and I'm sure fresh in the minds of China's top diplomat, Yang Jiechi, who was saying most of the comments that have been spread internationally. Like you said, we have few friends around the globe at this point, maybe none, but arguably few. Last week, in the span of about 48 hours, the United States sanctioned not just China and Russia, which is par for the course at this point, but also Germany and India, who are at least nominally have been considered our allies. And they are, on the periphery of this sort of Eurasian bloc that has been in the formation for years, centered around China and Russia, but increasingly incorporating some diplomatic and economic ties with other nations on the periphery. And it shows signs of expanding, which leads me to wonder, what the heck is going through the heads of the primary inhabitants of the State Department and Biden's administration? I guess I can see a little bit more about where Trump was going. He was trying to talk tough with China, trying to engage in a trade war to cripple them somewhat, but that seemed to be with the long-term goal of bringing them to the table to negotiate some new status quo. I'm not saying that was a good move on his part, but at least I understood where he was going. At this point, it just seems like Biden and his crew are pushing back against a status quo that they do not know how to confront, and that they lack any vision for how to assert their version of American supremacy in a realistic way in the century that we're entering into. What do you think is going through their minds?
I think you've nailed it. They have no clue what to do except of imposing sanctions and adopting what Donald Trump has done by imposing the harshest sanctions. They think in terms of how we can impose further sanctions on nations and not how we can befriend with nations. Now, first of all, yes, I want to make it clear. The United States doesn't have friends because the United States said, I have interest. I don't have friends because friends can shift. We saw how the United States did with Egypt at the time of Hosni Mubarak, with Tunisia, with other leaders around the world that were considered the friend of the United States. Now, what the Americans are doing is saying, hey, we are lacking ideas. And the only thing we can do is because we hold the SWIFT transfer, we hold with the dollar is the currency that is going around the world and everybody's dealing with it. Now we can impose sanctions on country and on companies and on banks. And they're going to, as you rightly said, to Germany. They're going to India. These are supposed to be allies, not friends, but allies. So therefore, we see the lack of ideas the Americans are having in this administration because they haven't invented something new to approach the world. And I think this is a point of weakness, it's not points of strength. If the only thing you can show to your opponent how big your muscle is, that's really very poor.
It depends. If I can be grotesquely cynical for the moment, I've always made the argument that there's no such thing as world law. That, there's nothing out there that's going to prevent us from destroying ourselves if we indeed destroy ourselves, and that void will not care one iota if we do. Meaning, the only thing we have is what we have. If the U.S. or any particular state takes a perspective that there is no such thing as friends, human beings as friends, states have interests, what can you accomplish based on what you have at your disposal at the levers of power? And so, for example, take China, for example, and the Uyghurs. The United States was able to use the Mujahideen and their interests in Afghanistan as a way of basically undermining the Soviet Union, basically giving the Soviet Union their own Vietnam. Now, did we know, or did we invest ourselves in that country? Yes. Did the Soviet Union know we were investing ourselves in the country before the world knew? Yes. When the Soviet Union went in to do something about it, the world and the United States pointed and said, hey, look at those guys, despite the fact that it was a foreign policy issue of trying to get the Soviet Union embroiled into a quagmire. The Uyghurs is something similar with this. This is a similar policy, whether it's sending people into Libya, sending people into Syria and saying, hey, look at all of those people. They're rebelling against the government of that country. Hey, let's go help them out. It's that policy over and over again. The difference is China is such a large country, they don't have the capacity to do that in the way that they would do that with, let's say, a country in the Middle East. So they use Uyghurs and they say, hey, they're committing genocide. And on top of that, they would point out and try to get some level of internal, let's say, dynamic where they can invest their energies to externally, because they can't necessarily do it in any other scenario, be it militarily or from a world policy standpoint of resources. That's the way I see the world. I see the world as just action and consequence in the various states trying to do it. Is that really a weakness if indeed you hold the whip hand?
Well, you see, the Americans used to offer friendship, support, and offer values. And when the Chinese said to the US delegation, the world doesn't recognize the US values anymore, because we saw what happened under Trump, and we saw what happened at the Congress, and we saw how Trump behaved during his ruling, and we saw the Black Lives Matters, and the whole world was witnessing what's happening in the US. So therefore, there are no more value to offer here. And then, yes, you're right when you say they offered the Vietnam to the Russian in Afghanistan, but then they went and they sank in Afghanistan. And this is when Hillary Clinton said, the people we are fighting today are the same people we are funding, and we have funded. And they did again the same thing in Syria. And they trained a group of people of 30 people and spent 500 million on them to see all the weapons and the group going to Al-Qaeda. So we see a total fiasco everywhere. When the Americans are saying to the Chinese, we're not happy what you are doing with the Muslims in your country. Well, what the Americans have done in Afghanistan for the Muslim of Afghanistan.
Perfect example. Look at what you guys are doing to the Muslims in China. Hey, look at what you did to the Muslims in Afghanistan, for the Muslims in Libya, for the Muslims in et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Perfect example. The voice that you guys were listening to is Elijah Magnier. He is a veteran war correspondent, where you can find his writing on ElijahJM.wordpress.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about the situation in Yemen. We're joined by our guest, Elijah Maguire. He's a veteran war correspondent whose writing and reporting you can find at his website, ElijahJM.wordpress.com. Oh, and you can also follow him on Twitter if you'd like, EJMAlrai, EJMALRAI over on Twitter. Elijah, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the situation in Yemen. The war, really, which, again, ongoing for years now. I actually wanted to do a brief retrospective with you on that war. All signs appear to be, every side at this point is inching towards some slightly more peaceful resolution. This comes after a Saudi invasion of the country backed by the United States, which the U.S. has apparently become increasingly wary of as we have tried to pull away from Saudi Arabia. Although, again, that I'm stumbling a little bit, even though that admittedly has kind of backfired on itself. We tried to pull away from King Salman, just happened just a couple of weeks ago. But Biden didn't do all that much to push back on Salman. This is, of course, over the Saudi-backed killing of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey. The press here in the States, I'll just put it like this, pretty much across the board was saying that Biden should have done more. And if we want to step up or stepping back from Saudi Arabia, I would think the way we would do that is by stopping supporting them in Yemen. We've said we would do that, but we haven't said that we would stop sending them armaments, which they could repurpose to use in Yemen. Again, this is slightly old news at this point. In the last couple of days, though, Antony Blinken has said that, and other Secretary of State memos have come out, all criticizing Houthi attacks. They call them Irani-backed or Iranian proxy groups attacking Saudi Arabia on their soil. Can you please fill this in for us? To me, coming at this from a sort of more naive American perspective, it seems if Saudi Arabia invades Yemen, and they're fighting primarily with the Houthi rebel group, the Houthi group in Yemen, wouldn't it be justified for the Houthis to strike back against the country invading them? What am I missing here, Elijah?
Well, let's talk about what you just said. Biden said he's no longer sending weapons to Saudi Arabia because Donald Trump sold enough weapons to Saudi Arabia. But let's say the Saudis need to refill and the Americans are no longer willing to sell them more bombs. However, we just see the US allies, the United Kingdom, is selling for £1.4 billion to Saudi Arabia bombs. Italy is selling the bombs needed for Saudi Arabia. The French are selling, the German are selling. So the selling of bombs hasn't stopped, really. And what Biden is doing is not stopping the war. Biden is trying to slow down the war and giving more possibility for Saudi Arabia to see what they can achieve, particularly now that the Houthi, that everybody is called rebels, but 70% of the Yemeni live under their ruling, they have conquered their part of their country, and particularly they are at the gate of the city of Marib that is rich of oil. And this city is occupied by Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they're all fighting in the city. And that is a common knowledge. I'm not revealing anything secret or exclusive. And the city of Marib has oil. And what's going to happen if the Houthi control Marib, the war is almost finished, because then they have the oil, they have what they need for transport and electricity and everything else, and they can continue fighting the Saudis and expelling the invader Saudis from their country. Now, the Saudis have been going on with this war for the last 6 years, starving Yemen, and creating the largest humanitarian crisis ever in the world. These are the words of the United Nations. And they do not stop bombing Sana'a. Even yesterday, they bombed the capital of Yemen, that is Sana'a. Therefore, we don't see any seriousness from Saudi Arabia, neither the Americans, to stop the war and to release the 14 ships and tankers that are in the water opposite the Yemeni shores, and they're not allowing them to offload their cargo into Yemen to support the Yemeni. So why they're not doing that? So this is just by stopping to sell the bomb, is that enough to stop the war in Yemen? Or is that enough to tell the world, hey, I am a new president of the United States and I want to do something humanitarian and I want to stop selling the bomb to Saudi Arabia, but he's not stopping the bombing of Saudi Arabia and Yemen.
Let's be clear. Just an American audience may be shocked to hear this, and I think often they're probably shocked to hear the things that we say. It doesn't necessarily make it any less true. This is the New York Times. I love these type of sources because these type of sources get to the reality of like, all right, it is in your world. They're just putting it in a particular way. Among other reasons, the White House needed to placate the Saudis as an administration completed a nuclear deal with Iran, Saudi Arabia's arch enemy. That fact alone eclipsed concerns among many of the president's advisors that the Saudi-led offensive would be long, bloody, and indecisive. Mr. Obama soon gave his approval for the Pentagon to support the impending military campaign. There was very little debate, very little conversation. Obama had other objectives that he wanted to accomplish, and he gave the Saudis his go-ahead. My point is, this is a U.S.-backed and supported war. And even under Trump, we found out that our forces apparently have been engaged in some of the operations in this in somewhat of a secret way. Biden can stop this tomorrow. Let's be very honest. I don't believe for a moment that if the United States put its foot down and came out against this war, that this war wouldn't stop. And there's another point. Saudi Arabia has to be possibly one of the most incompetent governments in the history of governments. They are number, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth in the world in military expenditures per year. And they can't beat a band of what is continuously called, in the way that you put it, rebels. Are these guys actually rebels? Meaning, is Saudi Arabia that incompetent? Or are the Houthis just that good as a rebel force? What are we missing in this conversation? Something's missing here.
Well, they are Yemeni. They're not rebels. They are rebels against the Saudi occupation, against the Emirates occupation. The Emirates said we're no longer fighting, but because the Emirates understood that if they continue fighting, they will be bombed as they were bombing Yemen. The Saudis are still insisting in bombing Yemen, and they are getting bombed, replied by the Yemeni. These Houthis are Yemeni. The Saudis are Saudis. They're not Yemeni. What on earth they are doing in Yemen? The Saudis and the Emiratis are occupying a country, and the Yemeni Houthis are the citizen of the country defending their territory against the invader.
No, I get that part. I mean, but even if that's true, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have, let's say, the military might. Like, for example, even if the Houthis are Yemeni defending their territory, fair enough. But Saudi Arabia is spending like $61 billion a year. Why can't they use that military to their ends to beat what seems to be a very extremely poor country? That's all I'm getting at. It seems like for the military might that they have at their disposal and the weapons they've been buying all of these years and storing up, there's a level of incompetence there in having that much military capacity, but that inability to use it. That's what I'm getting at. I don't believe for a moment that Yemen or the Houthis have that much military capacity at their disposal against the amount of money. Saudi Arabia, $61 million or $61 billion. I don't believe that they have that much military might. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Saudi Arabia don't seem to be able to use the weapons at their disposal to accomplish their objectives. Or the Houthis have been extremely good at using what they have at their disposal, the little resources they do have, to basically maintain and take back their territory. That's what I'm getting at. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And allow me, if I may, to give you an example. Since 1979, the Americans imposed sanctions on Iran. They forced Iran to be self-sufficient. In 2015, Saudi Arabia declared war, supported by the US, Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy. The whole world supported Saudi Arabia. And they failed. Why? For a simple reason. You can't fight the people of the earth. You can't find the people who belong to the ground. This is the Yemeni territory, and the Saudis are invaders. Invaders never won, never ever. Look at the Americans with all their strengths in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, everywhere. They haven't won. Even they are strong because they don't belong to the country. And this is why Saudi Arabia is going to fail. And the Yemeni, it is their territory. So as long as they are the people of the earth, the people of Yemen, fighting an invader, they will not lose. Many people will lose their life, but they will not lose their land at the end of the day. If it is not them, their children, they are continuing fighting. And they're pushing the Yemeni to invent, to produce new bombs, to defend themselves, to retaliate. They don't have an air force, but they have missiles. They were forced to produce missiles. They don't have the satellites and all the intelligence services supporting them like they are supporting, like the world is supporting Saudi Arabia, but they have drones and they have armed drones and they don't hit civilian targets in Saudi Arabia. They go and hit the oil, they go and hit specific targets, while Saudi Arabia is hitting markets, is killing population, is hitting cars driving in the street in Yemen. That is the difference.
And let's be specific here. I mean, part of how the Houthis have been able to fight off Saudi Arabia is they have the backing of Iran. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Iran is effectively supporting the Houthis in their, I wouldn't even call it a rebellion exactly, but in their attempt to stave off a Saudi-led invasion, backed, of course, strongly by the West, backed, of course, like you've said, by the United States, by Canada, by France, a Saudi-led invasion of the country. It seems like a lot of this revolves around the aftermath, all of it revolves around the aftermath of the Arab Spring as it came to Yemen. Can you please talk about President Hadi, what he was pushing for, what he was pursuing, why there was this strong backlash against him? We've only got a couple of minutes, Elijah, but please get into it if you would.
The position of Yemen is extremely powerful and strategic for Israel, for the United States, and for Saudi Arabia. And Iran was not in Yemen. Iran jumped in Yemen to support the Yemeni. And it is thanks to Iran, the people of Yemen are able to defend themselves. Although Yemen is asking the Americans to talk, they said, we want a good relationship with the Americans. We want good relationship with the Saudis. We don't have the exclusivity of Iran, but the position of Yemen on Bab el-Mandeb make it extremely attractive to all the country around it, that they think by forcing their will on Yemen, they can control it. They made a mistake.
Interesting. You know what, Elijah, we've only got about a minute left here, but this is also, another way to put it, this is the politics of the Arabian Peninsula. I'm sure at least that's how Saudi Arabia likes to see it. Do you think, just briefly, do you see this as them trying to exert their control over their peninsula? Is there a degree of ownership that comes into play on the high diplomatic level, looking at this as a sort of geopolitical chess game? Do they see this as their territory and they're trying to maintain control of that territory?
Yes, of course. If you look at the map of Yemen, it is giving on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. There is a lot of transit of oil is going to go through that once the Strait of Hormuz, that is on the Persian Gulf, is defined as hostile because it's under the control of the Iranians. The Americans are moving their command from the Persian Gulf in front of the Iranian shores to Yanbu on the other side, on the Red Sea, and they have to cross in front of Yemen. Also, the island of Socotra and other island, Yemeni island, where the Emiratis are based there, are extremely important strategically because they control the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This is why there is a war in Yemen.
Not just a tourist spot. And I don't mean to unnecessarily make it superficial, but Socotra, known for its intense ecology, but also, like you're saying, a immensely important strategic location. Elijah, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us.
There you go.
Absolutely. For those listening, that was the voice of Elijah Magnier, veteran war correspondent whose reporting and writing you can find at elijahjm.wordpress.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute on the other side of this short break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In this corner, I am the ever-vigilant, the indefatigable political analyst, your warrior, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, your sage, or something like that, Shane Stranahan, political analyst.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I keep feeling like something else belongs there, and I'm not quite sure what. And as I say that, look, I'm going to be honest with all of you before I get to the headlines. The more I work here and the longer that I do this job, I get very annoyed at mainstream media because I feel like I always used to ask, are they incompetent or are they lying? And I can never tell which. And I'm beginning to think it's a little bit of both. And the dropping of context is so aggravating. The not asking the questions that the American public needs to be asked is so aggravating. And it happens so constantly that it's just normal. And so when we are hitting an issue, if there's a certain degree of bitterness associated with it, it's that. I'm sick of the wars. I'm sick of not being able to have, relations with other countries in a way that doesn't necessarily end up in hostilities. And part of the thing that allows that is dropping context and making it look like we are love and light and everybody else is just attacking us. So it's aggravating, that's all. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 650 new coronavirus deaths and 55,621 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 54,190 cases per day, a decrease of 8% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,898,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 542,000 people died from it, the majority of which were people who were basically poor, middle class, who still had to work during the time of COVID because their needs forced them into those jobs. By the same token, they were our heroes back then, but now, since we have a vaccine, and since the virus is gone down to 650 as opposed to 5,000, those people are no longer deserving of $15 an hour. And whatever they get, they get. Suckers. Thanks a lot. Hashtag Joe Biden. Hate that number every time I read that number. By the way, that number of 650 is probably going to go up. Keep an eye on that. The things that have been taking place in the way that we've been opening up the economy and everything else, and even the spring break and all of that, it seems to be a situation where that number may go up. And more importantly, if that number goes up, I don't think the United States is going to have the capability of locking down the country again in the way that Germany and France are doing right now. I think there will be serious qualms if they tried. But we'll see. Two
sort of countervailing trends that I would argue push in the opposite direction. For one thing, usually there's a delay of a couple of weeks. Case numbers start to rise first, of course, because people have to catch it and you have to test them catching it before you hear about it. And then, a couple of weeks later, once the worst effects start to kick in, people get moved to ICU and they die there. that's, at least 2-3 weeks later, sometimes longer than that. So if we see cases rising again, that's when I'll think we're going to see more deaths. And so far, cases are still going down. It's dropped from consistently mid double-digit drops, around 30-ish% drops on a week-by-week basis, to now we're pretty consistently in the single-digit range. So the rate of the drop is slowing. But another side here is we didn't have vaccines the last time, and we have vaccines now, and that's still. It still remains to be shown exactly how much that's going to lower the rate of death, or lower the rate at which people, like you said, when the vaccines get lifted, there's a yo-yoing where the numbers start to go back up. We'll see what happens with vaccines. Hopefully it doesn't. I mean, I'm sure it will to some extent, but hopefully it doesn't. You get where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. We'll see. Give it a month. If I'm right, that number pops up slightly. If I'm wrong, it stays where it is. And that's good to be wrong on that one. One thing I do want to point out before going forward, Brazil and Europe. And right now, Germany is in a situation where apparently they're locking down again. France is locking down. Apparently Poland and some of these other countries have had these lockdowns. And meaning Europe has been having a hard go of it. The AstraZeneca vaccine, if you were offered that, would you take it? After the blood clot stuff. Even with the blood clot stuff.
Yes, I would. Yeah, we didn't ever really get in. I didn't really want to put my take front and center because I'm not a medical professional. I prefer to speak with somebody who is.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Wait. Go for it.
I hear you.
I guess from my standpoint, that doesn't really matter. What the perception matters in this case. And I think you're going to have a lot of people who say, whoa, that thing said blood clot. Screw that. I'm going to wait for the other one. I think it's going to be that. I don't know what that percentage is. I don't know what that number is. And the United States is now basically saying, yeah, we're putting that on ice because something was going on dodgy with the research.
Well, a little bit, but no, it seems like they're picking it back up this week. Like it seems like I forget where the major study came out, but within the last couple of days, earlier this week, yesterday or Sunday, a major study came out showing that it was safe. It was reasonably safe.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's moving closer to an emergency use authorization by the FDA, which is, of course, how all the vaccines that are now in use have been approved, quote unquote. They haven't been technically approved by the FDA, which is a long and much more arduous process. Anyway, on the blood clot specifically, from what I saw, it was like the base rate of incidence in the population. In other words, the number of people who got the vaccine and then got blood clots.
That's my point to you.
I know, but that's the.
And I get what you're saying. The science and everything else is basically saying there's no there to it. Is that fair?
I don't want to try to sum up the science. From what I've seen, yes. I don't know exactly what the science is still out in the same way that the jury is still out. So they're still doing studies on this stuff. I guess the way I see this though is this is blowback. This is like a double blowback from the European Union's war with the UK over Brexit, where it seems like a large part of the reason why they came to distrust AstraZeneca was it's like a lover scorned or something. They thought they were going to get it. Then the UK started to quote unquote hoard it. The UK started to use it for domestic use. The EU tried to force the UK's hand with Brexit and Northern Ireland and the border there. And then the members of the EU started to get pissed about the UK not going along with that. And then members of the EU public, including in Germany specifically, started to get even more pissed and were just side-eyeing the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm really speaking about that.
Yeah, I don't buy this. Yeah, I'm not buying this argument because that's so radically cynical. That would mean that they're basically saying we're going to put a knife in this vaccine. Because keep in mind, the moment that you say anything is wrong with that vaccine, there's going to be a segment of the population that says, yeah, okay, I'll wait for the other one. I would not take the AstraZeneca vaccine after that.
I totally would. Yeah, I wouldn't feel any hesitation about it.
Yeah, I would wait.
I'll put
for
it like
the other
this:
one.
how many people in the UK have got it? How many people in the UK have received the vaccine?
Now that I don't know, but they've been doing well with it.
Tens of millions at this point.
Yeah,
exactly tens of millions at this point. Is the argument that there's some special genotype that members of the UK have that like nobody else is going to serve? I mean, they're not going to suffer the ill effects. Everybody else. No, I don't buy it. I think this is stupid people playing stupid games and not even being aware of what they're doing, but just masses of the public and politicians responding to domestic pressures, and then we feel the blowback from that.
I guess my issue with that is they're putting out a vaccine. It's mRNA. It's still science that is basically the public is the experiment on some level, especially for a long-term standpoint. And they see this kind of weird blood clot. And honestly, it could have been a rare blood type. It could have been a rare genome type. It could have been a rare anything. And they're like, all right, let's pause it. But the moment that you do that, you have a percentage of the population that says, I'm not going to touch that even if the science says it's okay. That's what I'm saying. I'm getting into public perception of it. I had issue with blood clots before. So it's like if there's any potential of that being an issue, I don't want to take the chance. And I think there's going to be other people that may take it for various reasons, etc. I'm just making the point from public perception, the moment that that happens, people get wary of that. And I also want to point out that in Brazil, in Europe, the United States has been pushing these countries not to use Russia and China's vaccine. And then they're complaining that, well, the problem with their vaccine is that there are no strings attached. That's a problem? Yes. So you basically want to use your vaccine in order to get your foreign policy objectives accomplished. Yes. But that means that Brazil who is now in a crisis. Germany, if I'm not mistaken, the variant that's in Germany, Angela Merkel is basically saying this is basically a new COVID or something like that. Like, these are big deals. And these guys are still playing foreign politics. Like, think about that. Think about how craven and weird that is.
I hear you, and that's why I don't think I'm being too cynical. We play geopolitics with who we choose to get our vaccines from and who we choose to permit to get vaccines from others. It's that's par for the course. I just want to point out, I think this is technically the slowest headline segment we've ever had. We're still on the first headline.
I'm about to move on. I'm about to move on. But there were apt conversations. I think there were apt conversations.
It's true. No, I was part of it too. I'm not trying to.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said Monday that he plans to get vaccinated against coronavirus this week. Putin didn't specify which vaccine he would take. Russian authorities have approved 3 domestically developed shots: Sputnik V, Epivac Corona, and COVID Vac. Putin has to get Sputnik V, man. I mean, that's a satellite in space. How can you not get that? Not to mention his name after this network. Come on, dog. Get that vaccine. Police deployed water cannons and pepper spray after gathering of some 20,000 protesters against lockdown and other coronavirus rules in central Germany turned violent. Germany has announced that it will be extending its lockdown for 3 weeks. White House coordinator for Southern Border, Roberta Jacobson, and National Security Council's senior director for Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez, will travel to Mexico Monday and Guatemala later this week. The trip comes as migrant crossings of the U.S. southern border are increasing, with nearly 100,000 migrants detained at the border in February. Joe Biden nailed that. Nailed it. New photos from an overflow facility in Texas showed crowded conditions for migrants over the weekend amid an increase in the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border. An aide for Representative Henry Cuellar said each of the 8 pods in the facility has a 260-person capacity, but as of Sunday, one pod held more than 400 unaccompanied male minors. Wow. Cuellar believes the conditions are terrible for migrant children, and though agents are, quote, doing the best they can under the circumstances, unquote, they are not equipped to care for children and need help from the Biden administration. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday defended the Biden administration handling of the new surge of unaccompanied minors at the border, saying the American people will look back on this and say that we secured the border and upheld our values. Our values. I love that. I always love it when they talk about their values. Look, the reality of it is, just because you do something, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, doesn't necessarily mean the universe is going to give you a special blessing of ensuring that thing turns out well. In fact, oftentimes when you're doing something for the right reasons, you get credit for it because there's a loss involved in it. In this very specific instance, Joe Biden had a responsibility. He comes in the office, and instead of him keeping a policy that at the very least allowed a certain management of the border, Joe Biden decided to take unaccompanied kids. Well, that created an incentive for people to bring unaccompanied kids. The border conditions with COVID and everything else forces basically cut down the number of beds and everything else because of safety conditions. But at this point, it's policy that did this. And it's poor policy. And whether it's for the right reasons or not is almost irrelevant to the point that this was the outcome. Cause and effect. The universe does not care about your good actions. And as president, your job goes beyond that. It's not that I'm against bringing unaccompanied minors into the country. I think we need to stop destroying those countries. I think, and I agree with Shane, like you said earlier, there need to be some means of reparations to bring those countries up to standard so those people wouldn't necessarily have to flee those countries. And yet, we don't learn from our mistakes. Right now, we're agitating against Bolivia because the coup that took place that we clearly backed was overturned. And we're agitating. We're agitating to get rid of Maduro in Venezuela. Again, just like we were perfectly okay with doing it in Honduras, or for that matter, there was one other country recently. I guess my point is we don't seem to learn. We are setting those countries on fire with our drug policies, with our drug intakes, and yeah, in this case, the coups. If you want the people to stop coming, maybe you shouldn't have a policy that says you're going to take kids, whether it's good, bad, from a moral and ethical standpoint. And 2, stop investing in those coups. For God's sake. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the indomitable Ted Rawls.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking China, finishing up a conversation we were having before we move to immigration with our guest, Ted Rawls. Coming back to his intro in just a second, but to set this up for folks, this past weekend, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with China's top diplomat in Alaska. And on Friday, this was the news over the weekend, I would say, the biggest bit of news, specifically internationally. If you're here in the United States, the other big bit of news was immigration, which again we'll be coming back to. But Blinken shared some harsh words with his Chinese counterpart. I would argue this signals a sort of seismic shift in American relations with China. Just a few short months ago, Antony Blinken signed on to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's claim that China was a nation guilty of committing genocide. It seems that China has taken that to heart and decided to respond to it on their terms, telling the United States effectively to back off, that you cannot dictate to us what we're going to do from a position of strength. And again, signaling a long-term shift in their eyes and in ours, I would say, in terms of not who's in charge necessarily, but whether one nation is in charge at all. For this conversation, we are joined by our guest, Ted Rawls. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you can follow on Twitter at Ted Rawls, and whose cartoons and articles you can read at rawls.com. Ted, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. How are you doing this morning?
I am excellent. How are you?
I'm good. And I think both Jamarl and I are better for having you on. So thank you again for being with us. Big words this weekend. And they've kind of echoed around the world. And as I pointed out in our conversation with Elijah Magnier earlier this morning, this comes as the United States, despite Biden and now Secretary of State Blinken saying effectively America is back on the international stage. It was just last week that in the span of about 48 hours, we sanctioned not only China and Russia, which are par for the course at this point, but also Germany and India, ostensibly our allies. It seems like we're on increasingly thin ice, and we've decided to walk out there. I don't know if or when we're going to fall through or what that looks like. We do still have, our naval supremacy. We still have massive carrier fleets. We still have air supremacy. We have some of the military advantages here, but when it comes to soft power and increasingly our economy, it seems like we're starting to suffer. And of course, we have for years now been set against China as the sort of two main contenders for the dominant geopolitical power of this century. How do you think this weekend changed that balance of power? What do you think this weekend signaled, Ted?
Well, China plays the longest of all long games, and they've been kind of prepared and waiting for this moment for decades, I would argue, possibly a century. China is tired of being pushed around. They still have the memory of the 19th century experience of carving up the Chinese melon with concessions to the Brits, the French, and the U.S. and other foreign powers, where they literally had to give up parts of their city in Shanghai. This is to foreign countries, where they were subjected to opium addiction almost by force at the hands of the Brits. They were humiliated, and they're never going to go back there. And at this point, this was an announcement to the Biden administration. Look, you guys have to stop thinking of us as just at most an emerging regional superpower. You have to understand that we're now equals, at least in our sphere of influence, and arguably that's going to change globally. And you need to start showing some respect and negotiate accordingly instead of thinking that you can push us around. I think it was, frankly, an accurate assessment of the situation. They're right in terms of that's where things are. And it's probably smart for American voters to start understanding that they're no longer the only big dog.
Ted, it's very strange because, as the reporters are listening to these guys call China genocidal, we're still working with them. I mean, they're our third largest trading partner. How weird is it that we're working with a country that is supposedly committing genocide? State Department lawyers concluded insufficient evidence to prove genocide in China. My assessment is that this is basically the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, with the United States basically trying to find some kind of internal dynamic in order to create friction internally, and trying to delegitimize the country externally using these kind of charges. And I think, honestly, that the West doesn't know how to deal with China. I don't think it knows how to deal with it economically. I think that horse is out of the barn. Technologically, that horse is out of the barn. And in its alliances, from the standpoint of the money that it's been investing with all of these countries over the course of, the last several years for the Silk and Road Initiative, whereas we've been blowing up countries and using basically threats and force. The U.S. even made the point that says the problem with the Chinese vaccine and the Russian vaccine is that there are no strings attached. They'd want to help people, without trying to get foreign policy objectives. We can't deal with that. I guess my thing is, how do you frame this? Am I being too cynical? Am I thinking of this? Because to me, this is no different than the terrorists, the freedom-loving terrorists that are chopping heads and raping women when we send them into Syria, or the kill squads that are in South America that we're calling, just pro-democracy kill squads or whatever. It's the same motif played over and over again. This time, the catch just becomes China because we can't compete with them in the traditional sense. What are your thoughts? Am I being too cynical there? Or do you think that, that seems to be the geopolitical calculus involved in this from the standpoint of the West?
Well, I don't think it's possible to be too cynical when it comes to politics. And I think you could be more cynical. I think your assessment's exactly spot on. And I would go further and say that the U.S. is fighting sort of the last diplomatic war, both with its own voters domestically as well as internationally with China. And what I mean by that, on the Uyghur issue, look, I visited Xinjiang the first time in 1997. Basically, bringing the Uyghurs into the fold and suppressing the independence movement and really bringing that part of China, which actually became an independent state called East Turkestan from 1933 to 1944. So that gives you some sense of the history. This is kind of on the outside. It's on the periphery. It's kind of like China's Alaska. It's the outer edge of the empire. Bringing them in, that's happened over the last 25 years. It's kind of over. It's like the Tibet thing. It was in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Maybe some leverage could have been imposed, but not anymore. Not to mention the U.S. doesn't have really any kind of standing, even with its own voters, to complain about human rights abuses in other countries. Because, look, we have Guantanamo. We have legalized torture still. We, we have all sorts of domestic abuse, as the Chinese pointed out at the Anchorage meeting, with our own police against people of color and white people as well. So basically ever since Jimmy Carter left office, the message domestically has been, we don't care about human rights abuses at all. So how do we expect American voters to care about alleged human rights abuses in other countries? It's ridiculous. They don't. There's no traction with U.S. voters, and the Chinese are smart. They know. They understand the situation. The days of the U.S. having anything to talk about in that arena are long gone, and everyone knows. You take a look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Despite the fact that they butchered and slaughtered a journalist in their own consulate, but everything just keeps going along, easy as pie, no sanctions there. That's the way of the world. We're all about the Benjamins.
It's true. I mean, and the thing about the moral high ground is that in some sense it is made of sand. What's stronger is what's a stronger bedrock is your economy, your military. On the military front, I would argue we're still doing decently. I would say this: the China hawks who say that China's demise is imminent are flatly wrong. I think also the U.S. hawks. I don't think America is going to immediately go into a tailspin. I think we're in a long, slow cycle of decay. It's going to take a while, which is setting us up for this long, drawn-out, years, decades-long confrontation. Which I would argue, recent events, specifically COVID, but even if you expand it over the past decade, recent events have shown which one of our states is on the upswing and which is on the downswing over this longer scale. Here's what strikes me, and I want to come back. Jamarl, during his monologue earlier on in the show, was brought up, I think, a very good issue. He's been watching State Department briefings, and he brought in these clips where reporters were asking Jen Psaki a couple of questions, and they're sort of befuddled. You can hear it in their voice. We don't have enough time for me to play them, so I'll just briefly recap. First question that he played, a reporter asking basically, what is our, I'll give the answer.
Basically, did you get what you wanted out of your conversation with China?
That's exactly right.
Right.
Did you effectively get what you wanted? And Jen Psaki's response was effectively, well, we're going to work with China where we need to. We're going to collaborate where we need to. We're in this competitive space. That sentiment, of course, has been echoed by Blinken himself, who is, engaged in these meetings. Second question, effectively on sanctions. Are there more sanctions coming against China for their genocide? And Psaki more or less demurred on that one, but backed up, as she would do, the sanctions that we've implemented, and said, if effectively we did the right thing here. And what Jamarl brought up in that point is that there is a serious contradiction between those two premises. What nation, if we were to look around the world stage at this point, if another country decided to work with a genocidal country, say it were 1938 or 1943 or something like that, and World War II for some reason, in 1943 hadn't kicked off, but you knew about the Nazis, you knew what they were doing, we'd found out about the concentration camps. If we looked at another country deciding to work with the Nazis, and we painted it in genocidal terms, as it should have been painted, obviously, how would we feel about that country? How do we portray that country historically? Well, we would obviously portray them as traitors and as near the low level of moral degradation of the Nazis. We would view them on that scale, and yet we have both accused China of committing genocide. Both the past administration and the current one have accused China of committing genocide, and at the same time are saying that we're willing to collaborate with them, yes, and compete with them. But literally, Blinken himself, a couple of months ago, signed on to Pompeo's statement that they were a genocidal nation, has said we will collaborate with them where it suits our interest. That seems like if anything's going to erode the moral high ground, it seems like that'll do. On our own terms, and I want to turn to you here, Ted. We're willing to work with a genocidal nation. I disagree with that term, but it seems like a naked contradiction. What's your take?
It is a naked contradiction. Hey, Jimmy Carter, who is going to shed this mortal coil sooner rather than later, and is the epitome of the human rights presidency, in our lifetimes, He admitted the Shah of Iran, who had a horrific human rights record, for medical treatment and precipitated the hostage crisis. The U.S. You can't really have it both ways, but the U.S. always tries to have it both ways. We work with and trade with and arm and fund tons of nasty dictatorships, authoritarian regimes all around the world. Saddam Hussein was our good friend for many, many years against Iran. And then we try to turn around and say that we care about these issues. Everyone kind of knows it's not true. And what it does is it discredits us internationally because most people in other countries are very well informed about foreign affairs. Here in the U.S., where all the news is discussed with inanity, like the British royal family, people don't really know what's going on. And so they count on the ignorance of the people. But it has still, it's this weird thing where effectively, as citizens of the U.S., and we learned this when we travel overseas, we are massively discredited, and everybody looks at us and thinks that we're idiots or worse. We're certainly hypocrites because this government's supposed to be accountable to us in a democracy, and clearly the American voters don't know or care enough to try to change this. But yeah, it's very it's obviously massively rampantly talking out of two sides of your mouth.
And just to make a quick point before we close, I'm sorry, Shane. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think, and Jamarl, I know that you said the same thing. Americans are busy, and yes, people around the globe are busy too. But I think part of it is, the media. People trust the media, I would say, less than ever at this point, but they don't know where to turn for some more accurate perspective. And people, get up, go to their job, come home, try to spend some time with their family, often if they have one, and then they go to sleep and rinse and repeat. And often this continues through the weekends in the state that the economy is currently in. And I mean, we're actively trying to figure out, how do you break through? How do you raise the sanity waterline when it comes to political news? Because the stake of our world is seriously on that, I think, if our democracy has any meaning anymore. Jamarl, didn't want to cut you off there. What were you going to say?
No, you're fine. I cut you off. No, I was going to close it out, but I was just going to make a point. The hypocrisy angle and the hypocrisy thing. This kind of gets to the other question that nobody really brings up in the press. This is Reuters. The United Nations says at least 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims have been detained in, I think is what, Xinjiang. I have a hard time pronouncing that. Faith leaders, activist groups, and others have said that crimes against humanity, including genocide, are taking place there. 1 million Uyghurs. Clinton killed 500,000 kids with their sanctions, and Madeleine Albright basically said it was necessary and good, despite the fact that they ended up in a war in the very next president, which ends up killing 1 million Iraqis. You have tens of thousands of Libyans. You have 500,000 Syrians. You have sanctions killing Iranians to the tune of tens of thousands, and Yemenis. And all of those wars started in March. March is the month right here. March 24th, bombing of Yugoslavia. March 20th, invasion of Iraq. March 15th, war in Syria. March 19th, invasion of Libya. March 26th, genocide in Yemen. Hypocrisy on a mass scale. We've killed more Muslims than they're supposed to have in those camps. Nobody will bring that point up. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment, continuing with Ted Raw.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. As we've been having this conversation, the border is a crisis. The border is a quagmire, to put it mildly. Donald Trump was basically the rabid face of stay out, gritting his teeth, bulging at the throats. And in combination with COVID-19, you had this kind of weird situation where people stayed out. They weren't wanted. The situation from the standpoint of ICE and some of these other groups were making it brutal. Even when they got here, and the conditions in the camps, American style, was not necessarily the greatest. Joe Biden comes in, and regardless of what Joe Biden presents as a face, it is not Trump. In fact, the very political casting of them putting out opposition against Trump creates a softer image of the United States. And Joe Biden makes the choice to basically accept kids. Right here, New York Times. In mid-November, a federal judge ruled that the administration could not, NOT, expel unaccompanied children. As a result, expulsions of unaccompanied children fell nearly 3,200 in October to 1,500 in November to just 3 in December, 18th of January. An appeals court stayed that ruling in January, once again allowing expulsions of children. However, the Biden administration has decided against the practice. It continues to send back adults. However, it keeps kids. So what does that incentivize? People leaving their hostile countries. Hostile because of the drug policies of the U.S. Hostile because of the drug use of the U.S. and the population itself. Beaten down by work and beaten down by stress. And hostile because of the coups that take place. Now, none of those things are up for discussion from the standpoint of mainstream media when they're talking about this issue. It is only talked about from the standpoint of what is the president going to do. At the end of the day, there's a crisis at the border, and mainstream media has a hard time talking about it in terms that are substantive, that gets the public a full context of why and how to alleviate it. To have this conversation, we're continuing to be joined by Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. And Ted, again, thank you for joining us, man. So, Ted, like I mentioned before.
He dropped.
Oh, okay. I was wondering. I was like, okay, he's very silent at this moment, and I'm not quite sure why. All right, so we're probably going to be trying to get Ted Rall back. But to bring this in, again, press conference. I often look at who is asking questions and the questions that they ask. They think about these questions. This is not something where it's a back and forth and a fluid discussion. They have a very clear idea of what they want to ask when they go there and they ask. And I think you guys are wasting time. I am slightly bitter because I would rather be there asking that question, and it is a waste of a question. For example, this one. Are you guys, well, first, every so often somebody sneaks in though. So like this one. Are you guys shacking up migrants at the Best Western? Now, Shane and I talked about this yesterday, and I asked, hey, why can't they just put them in hotels? I mean, if you really need to find somewhere to put the migrants, just quarantine them in the various hotels, buy it up. What's the big deal? Shane said he will be attacked if he did that. And right here, let's play the clip. Saki, are you shacking up those migrants, those illegal people in hotels? Let's play the clip.
Also, you are opening up new facilities. One of the options that's being reported over the weekend is spending $86 million on hotel rooms for some migrants and feeding them. How do you square that with the National Guard troops who were sleeping in parking garages and, you know, some of them got sick from having contaminated food? That's a disparity a lot of people are pointing out, that our National Guard was treated one way, and then illegal immigrants are going to be put in hotel rooms.
Well, first, let me say that at the time when we became aware of the conditions, National Guard troops were in parking garages, as you noted. The president called the head of the National Guard that day and offered his assistance, offered to play any role that he could play, boosting morale, asking for more aid, making sure they had the right, were treated in the way that they deserved for the incredible role they've played. So I know that was some time ago, but that was the reaction he took at the time.
If I may, one more on Rachel Levine. Her confirmation has gotten a lot
let's
of
kill this right here. Notice she didn't answer the question about the hotels. Did you guys notice that? What do you think about that, Ted? I was making the point earlier. You dropped by accident, but I was making a point earlier that the ineptness of this administration, meaning regardless of whether or not Joe Biden was trying to do something that was for the good or for the better, meaning we're going to take kids, it is an action that will incentivize more kids to be brought over and deposited at the United States, knowing that Biden is going to keep them. What, the number I just accounted for was, 3? And it's up to, 15,000 just a few days ago or whatever that have showed up at the border? So what do you think about that? How do you frame that? And secondary, the way that media, for whatever reason, can only talk about this from the standpoint of migrants, border. Those are the barriers. They can't get into drug policy. They can't get into, coups. Like, for example, 80% of the cocaine goes through Honduras. And Hillary Clinton was perfectly okay with getting rid of Zelaya, the president at that point of Hong Kong. Of Honduras, who was basically one of those troublesome lefties like Maduro or Chavez. And so once they got rid of this guy, well, the guy who's in there now is talking about putting cocaine into the nose of pretty much every American. Meaning we don't talk about how our foreign policy affects the people who are showing up at the border. And we don't pay attention to this notion that if those countries were whole, those people would not be traveling here. What are your thoughts?
I was just having a conversation with a sort of right-wing friend of mine. Yes, I do have right-wing friends who, he was making this point, and I said, he said, well, Biden's already told them not to come to America. And I was like, well, I wonder how many people in Honduras are even able to hear Biden's entreaties not to come to the border after their economy was completely destroyed because, as you pointed out, the Obama administration was a party to the overthrow of their country, and it plunged into chaos afterwards. And, I just wonder how many people have good, strong cable connections down there so that they could hear it. This is, yes, obviously, there's never any, as we were talking before the break, the ignorance of the American viewer about the sort of big picture causes of foreign policy problems is just, it's endless. If you travel, or you don't even have to go anywhere. You can just watch any foreign outlet, whether it's say BBC or TF1 or anything overseas, or Al Jazeera. You'll watch the coverage is always very international. It's not. BBC isn't leading 90% of the stories are not about Britain. They'll be like today's lead story in Mauritius.
Exactly.
And now Seychelles. And now we're going to go to Malaysia. The world is their topic. And a lead story is wherever something important in the minds of the producers is happening. That's just not the case on American media. I mean, the absence of it's gotten even worse with the demise of print media because 90% of the news originates still in print newspapers, old-fashioned dead tree outfits. And those foreign bureaus that used to be in places like Paris and Kabul and Tokyo have closed. So the news isn't even being generated by American reporters anymore. And it's not like they're translating it from foreign outlets and adapting it for American viewers. They believe Americans don't care. And I know that's not true. I used to have a radio show in Los Angeles, and as a joke, I started to do breaking news from Central Asia to sort of joke about this matter. Well, the joke was totally on me because it became by far the most popular segment on the show. People actually wanted to know what was going on in Central Asia because they couldn't find out. So there's an appetite among Americans. Are not stupid. Americans want to know what's going on. They're fascinated when they hear about what Obama and Clinton did in Honduras and how that's having the effect of this migration flow across the border. But unfortunately, there's not going to be any will to political sanity unless you have voters who are willing to and able to, who have the knowledge that's going to spark, political pressure on our leaders.
Well, I mean, and that would be very good if we were able to do that. You know what? This is actually an interesting thing. I was going to follow up on comments you'd making. You sort of answered a question that I was going to ask. I was going to ask, how can you've traveled and reported from around the world, and like you just brought up, you had a radio show. You were talking about Central Asia. People were actually interested in it. I was going to ask, how do you break through? How do you get this stuff out to people if they're largely disinterested? But I think you're right. I don't think they actually are disinterested. I think people are busy. But first and foremost, I just don't think they have access to this information. They don't know where to look for it. Still, having said that, it's interesting to hear that note of optimism, and it's very good to hear that from you. Having said that, I will follow up. How would you recommend we do it better? I mean, we try to talk about this stuff on a daily basis, but if we want to break through a little bit more widely, I'm being blunt here. I'm being just very, kind of honest and naked. How would you recommend we do that? Because I really do think that, for our network, for our show, for people in this position, it's important that we're able to do that. So we're sort of behind the scenes. Any advice, Ted?
Well, I think it's like when choosing stories, when producers and hosts are and program directors are looking at, what are we going to look at today? Maybe instead of just, sort of going, I'm guilty of this too as a cartoonist. I look first at all the American outlets, that I can read, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Instead of looking at that stuff, sort of have this view like, well, let's look at a more global view and let's look at stories that are happening around the world. Obviously, there's, wire service, Reuters, AP, and those stories are right there at our fingertips in English, and we just have to dig them up. I mean, it's they're there. It's sort of just like having that viewpoint, I think, of that like a BBC producer. I'm not making any comment on the quality of their or the biases of their broadcast, but just that in terms of topically, I think they tend to just sort of look at the world as, because of their historical legacy as an empire, they look at it, it's all part of something that British viewers would be interested in, or listeners would be interested in. And I think people really do want to hear. I mean, people can't listen to something that's not on the air. You have to broadcast it.
It's true. It's true. We got to close it here, Ted. I think that, for centuries, because America, this is the classic line, because America has been geographically isolated, it's also sort of been mentally a little bit more introspective on a national level, where we tend to be obsessed with our affairs. And in the same way, I'll put it like this: in the same way that you're making the argument that because citizens of the UK once presided over an empire, they have sort of shifted their gaze outward slightly over the course of centuries. I would argue that the same thing is true, will be true, and will be proven true here in the United States, where people, as they start to recognize more fully the extent of our commitments overseas, what we've gotten ourselves involved in, what we have done internationally, I think a lot of attention is sort of waiting to be, focused on exactly that, on what's happening in other countries, specifically how we're involved with them. We do that daily, but we want to do as good a job of it as we can because it's vitally important. Ted, thank you for joining us. Great conversations this morning.
So fun. Thanks a lot.
And for those listening, that was the voice of Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at rall.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. You can't necessarily see me on the radio, but for those who are looking at me on YouTube or some other device of modern techno-wizardry, if I am looking like a younger man, it is because the subject is going to be on UFOs. The thing about this segment is that I'm going to hit on something that is profound, that is understated, and that apparently nobody else is paying attention to, even though they should be paying attention to. A big bit of news was made, I think it was Saturday or Friday, or Thursday or Friday, when former Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe, goes on Maria Bartiromo and makes the point that without hedge, without issue at all, without any sense or fear that he will be ridiculed for saying so, basically said there is loads of information about UFOs. We have no idea how they do what they do. They are beyond our technological capabilities, and as such, we do not believe any other place on this planet can replicate it. Now, there are some people like Jack Valet who goes with the hypothesis that it's not necessarily UFOs. It could be something weirder. It could be like an intelligence that has been with man that pushes man along the evolutionary trail. That's possible, but I'm going to go with Occam's razor on this point and think, well, maybe a being just like us can look in the sky and contemplate if they are alone. Monstrous. Solitude. The void. Is there something else out here that shares the light of consciousness? And can we make contact? And depending upon the levels of technological capabilities of the race, the levels of organization of the race, the resources they may have at their disposal, the understanding of physics, of consciousness, of all these things, we are just babies in this front. And something else is here, potentially. What Ratcliffe says here, and I'm going to let you hear the clip, but there is a congressional report that's coming up, and understand the gravity of what is taking place here. What if that congressional report says we are not alone? What does it mean? And if the United States has access to all of these materials and whatnot, Luisa Elizondo makes the point that it goes beyond just the visual representation of the stuff, that materials somewhere exist. Bigelow makes the point that there's a ship somewhere. So the people who are in the know are making the point that there's more. And I don't think that the military will be working with these guys if there wasn't. My point is, the moment that they say that, what about Russia? What about China? Why the radio silence? If the United States has those materials, I'm pretty sure Russia and China has also had those retrievals. Why the radio silence? What happens on an international level if indeed that congressional report says we are not alone? Something else is here. What does that mean for us as human beings? What does that mean for us on a geopolitical stage, dealing with other countries when we know there's something else out there? What does it mean? Nobody else is talking about this, but all of these things are rather profound. Let's play the clip of Ratcliffe on Fox.
Actually, is a program that's been in place for a few years in terms of a task force that has been there under the National Defense Authorization Act. But as you correctly point out, Maria, there's now a report that will be issued by the Pentagon, by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. I actually wanted to get this information out and declassified before I left office, but we weren't able to get it down into an unclassified format that we could talk about quickly enough. But frankly, there are a lot more sightings than have been made public. Some of those have been declassified. When we talk about sightings, we're talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots or have been picked up by satellite imagery that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, that movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for, or traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. So in short, things that we are observing that are difficult to explain. And so, there's actually quite a few of those, and I think that information is being gathered and will be put out in a way that the American people can see. We always, when we see these things, Maria, we always look for a plausible explanation. Weather can cause disturbances, visual disturbances. Sometimes we wonder whether or not our adversaries have technologies that are a little bit further down the road than we thought or that we realized. But there are instances where we don't have good explanations for some of the things that we've seen. And, when that information becomes declassified, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that.
You are in a new world.
Can you tell us where it was seen?
Actually, all over the world. There have been sightings all over the world. And when we talk about sightings, the other thing I will tell you is it's not just a pilot or just a satellite or some intelligence collection. Usually we have multiple sensors that are picking up these things. And so, again, some of this are just they're unexplained phenomenon. And there's actually quite a few more than have been made public. So I think it'll be healthy for as much of this information to get out there as possible so that the American people can see.
Ratcliffe is wasted on her. You need to come to fault lines, Ratcliffe. It's not that that's a horrible question, but that question needs to be, you need to get him, you need to trap him. There's information that he has that he doesn't want to give you. Throw powder on him. He can't necessarily tell you the information, but at the very least, you know that there's an invisible man standing there. It's just aggravating, that's all. Shane, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's a big deal. He's basically saying there's something, we don't know how it works. And by the way, gravity, if it's something that can manipulate gravity, then that explains the sonic boom being missing and speeds and etc. He knows stuff. He's basically saying there's loads of this evidence. And yeah, there's evidence that we don't understand. It's not replicated by our enemies. We have no idea what it is. Are we alone? And the question that Ratcliffe is basically saying, or the answer seems to be no. What's your thought, Shane?
I mean, or you could be reading into it. I mean, this is my classic take on this, and it's not just mine. I'm not trying to take credit for it or whatever. And it's admittedly the slightly more cynical take in its own way, although, and hey, it could be more optimistic. What if these are just other countries? Or what if this is our, secret advanced military agencies who are doing R&D on technology that the general public hasn't been made aware of yet? They saw what happened with the nuclear bomb. They saw that, if you start to develop this technology more or less in public, even though, of course, a lot of the details are actually still private on nuclear weaponry, then, other countries are going to pick up on it. And maybe at some point, the average citizen of the United States or another country could, with some difficulty, but nevertheless acquire the resources to make it. The idea being you want to keep the swords in the hands of people who you think should be using them. And so I can still see there being a completely credible argument. And part of what leads me to do this is, part of what leads me to this, not a conclusion, but this hypothesis tentatively is, why are they disclosing it? If I can see this going in a couple of ways. Maybe they want to, none of it makes sense to me though. Why are they slowly and sort of begrudgingly over the course of the first decades and more recently the span of just a couple of years, it really is accelerating. Why are they disclosing it? If it is aliens, if that is their presumption, or if that is their knowledge, why now? And if it isn't, the same question applies. Why now? Why are we giving this stuff away?
If you want. Well, it's not a unified front. Like everything else, there's certain factors of people who want the information out, and there's certain people who think that these guys are demons, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have this kind of pushback. Hillary Clinton, I honestly do believe a lot of this was fomented by Clinton. When she was getting into office, I think they saw her as a chance of getting the information out because she had a clear bias of wanting to open the books. And there was a concerted push to get the evidence out or the information out to give her the political thrust to get it. Donald Trump won. So it became this kind of weird, okay, we still got to go and push it out. And yet you're kind of in this kind of weird spot. They have been briefed. Look, I've said before, you've heard me say it multiple times, it's either us or it's not. And I think if it's us, that is even weirder on some level, because that would mean there's a breakaway aspect of our civilization that is so remote and so different that it seems off this world. Now, that's possible. If you find just the way of, let's say you figure out how to use electricity to manipulate gravity. What will those craft look like and what will those craft do? Well, probably stuff like that. But the catch is, these guys are saying it's not us, and they're pretty resolute on that front. And I got to be honest, I think it's probably both. I think it's probably us and not us.
I I don't know that I don't think I heard him say that. I think he said unexplained phenomena, which still comports with the idea that there are, unknown and undisclosed agents working with some government or governments that are responsible for this stuff. That's the thing. I haven't heard him say it.
It's not just him.
To nearly as much Luis Elizondo.
Yeah, it's Luis. It's the Fravor, the pilot that was in the sky. It's the signals testimony. It's the people who basically say I was on the boat on the Nimitz when the thing came out the water. It's a lot of people. And it's a lot of people who were there in the know who had eyes on that said it's technology. Just saying. But look, I'm okay with the idea that it made it, but that it might be us. So we got to.
I'm not closed off to the idea that it may be not us too. I'm open to comers when it comes to theories here. We've got to close this hour out. We will be back in a minute with headlines in the last hour of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour of this morning's show. The most disruptive show covering news, events, and politics across these divided states and the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the bringer of context, your man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning again, everybody. I hope you've had an absolutely wonderful morning. If you're just waking up, well, rise and shine. And if you've been with us through the full 3 hours, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do a brief recap here of today's show. At 7:30 a.m. Eastern, we spoke with Elijah Magnier about what's going on between the United States and China this weekend in Alaska and looking into the future, what the Biden administration is thinking with its China policy. We also discussed the invasion of Yemen, the war in Yemen, a Saudi-led Gulf coalition waging war on Yemen, a war that they appear to be losing, although it's still ongoing. But there are peace talks, calls for peace talks coming from the Biden administration. We'll see where that goes. At 8:15, not too long ago, we finished up a conversation with Ted Rall. In our first segment, we were talking a little bit more about China after, again, this weekend in Alaska, Antony Blinken met with Secretary of State Blinken, met with his Chinese counterpart, China's top diplomat, and there was a harsh war of words for about an hour that seems to have set the tenor for years of China-Biden relations. We finished that up with a conversation about migration and sort of more generally, Biden's migrant problems, and more generally, how we cover the news internationally. In our next segment, 9:15 to 9:45, we're going to be speaking with Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, about what's going on behind the scenes, what's going through Biden's mind, his staff's mind, Congress's mind when it comes to the issue of migration. There may be some back and forth with Joel. We will see. Anyway, without further ado, that's the show. Let's get into headlines. First up in COVID news. At least 650 new coronavirus deaths and 55,621 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 54,190 cases per day. That's a decrease of 8% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,898,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 542,000 have died from it. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Monday that he plans to get vaccinated against the coronavirus this week. He did not specify which vaccine he would take, but Russian authorities have so far approved 3 domestically developed shots: Sputnik V, Epivac Corona, and Covivac. In Germany, police deployed water cannon and pepper spray after a gathering of some 20,000 protesters against the lockdown in that country and other coronavirus rules got a bit violent. Germany has just announced that it will be extending its lockdown for 3 weeks. In national news, White House coordinator for the southern border, Roberta Jacobson, and the National Security Council senior director for the Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez, will travel to Mexico Monday and Guatemala later this week. This trip comes as migrant crossings of the southern U.S. border are increasing, with nearly 100,000 migrants detained at the border in February. I should say they did travel to Mexico Monday, and so I will. Meanwhile, new photos from an overflow facility in Texas show crowded conditions for migrants over the weekend amid an increase in the number of unaccompanied children crossing the border. An aide for Representative Henry Cuellar said each of the 8 pods in the facility has a 260-person capacity, but as of Sunday, one of those pods held more than 400 unaccompanied male minors. Cuellar believes that the conditions are terrible for the migrant children, and though agents were, quote, doing the best they can under the circumstances, end quote, that they are not equipped to care for children and need help from the Biden administration. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on Sunday defended the Biden admin's handling of the new surge of unaccompanied minors at the border. He said that the American people will, quote, look back on this and say that we secured the border and we upheld our values, end quote. I question that, but we'll come back to that in just a few minutes with our next guest. Former President Donald Trump on Monday said that he expected President Biden's fall on the steps of Air Force One, and that he also believes Biden's mental state may be diminished to the point that he may not understand what he's signing, opening the door to Kamala Harris replacing him. Trump also announced Monday he is endorsing GOP Congressman Jody Hice of Georgia in his campaign to unseat the state's Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Jamarl.
No, I'm sorry. I'm laughing. I'm sorry. Keep going. It's just funny.
All right. Hice, who represents Georgia's 10th congressional district, announced Monday he would run for Secretary of State and claimed Raffensperger created cracks in the integrity of our elections. Hice is a defender of Trump and echoed the former president's accusations of election fraud. South Dakota's GOP governor, Kristi Noem, declined on Friday to sign a bill from legislators that would have banned transgender girls from participating in women's high school sports. Noem said that she was sending the bill back to lawmakers for changes and indicated that she thought the ban should not be extended to college athletes. She added that banning transgender athletes from collegiate sports would cause conflicts with national college athletic associations. As currently written, the bill would require students to submit a form verifying their age, biological sex, and a lack of steroid usage in order to be eligible for high school athletic programs. A gunman opened fire inside a Colorado supermarket yesterday, killing 10 people, including a police officer. Many of the details surrounding the shooting remain clear. The suspect is in custody, but authorities did not share his identity or any information on the type of weapon used or any possible motive for that matter. In international news, it has been stated by 2 senior U.S. intelligence officials that Iran has made threats against Fort McNair, an Army post in the U.S. Capitol, and against the Army's Vice Chief of Staff. They say their intelligence also revealed threats to kill General Joseph M. Martin and plans to infiltrate and surveil the installation. Threats are one reason the Army has been pushing for more security around Fort McNair, which sits alongside Washington's newly developed waterfront district. Iran has not delivered any comments in reference to the report, but let's be pretty clear here. This is a serious accusation. If it's true, that's bad news. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated because, you know, we've killed many Iranians in the past year and some change, starting with Soleimani back in, you know, right at the beginning of 2020, the first couple of days of last year. But we continued with more assassinations. Having said that, I don't think turnabout is fair play in this case. If what they're saying is accurate, if there's a plan on the high level to raid the capital of the United States to drop bombs, that's not good either. But I'm kind of wait and see on this stuff. I'll put it like this. I generally, and it's really their fault, it really is, I've come to distrust the American intelligence community. Can you really blame me, Jamarl?
No, I can't blame you at all. I don't buy this. And because it's always, there's a vague report somewhere by anonymous people who you have no idea who they are. I mean, you can't really interrogate the report. You can't interrogate the people. There's a history of making this stuff, seemingly making it up. I can show you reports about Saddam Hussein about the released chemical weapons immediately. I can show you the OPC being pushed and media not even wanting to acknowledge when 5 people are coming and saying that report is dodgy. Meaning they would show the chemical weapons. They won't show the people who were there on the ground who's basically saying they lied about it. I could show you the OAS basically introducing information that is fraudulently wrong, seemingly at the behest of their largest funder, the U.S. And so, yeah, Shane, I'm like you on this, where I'm highly skeptical of the information that's pushed out. And let's not forget Russiagate. They still run with that. And so it's like, is there honesty somewhere in this process? I have no idea. Do I accept these reports like that? No. And turnabout is fair play, unfortunately. It's tit for tat. How are we going to say that it's fair game for them to invite Soleimani to Iraq, supposedly for a peace deal, and murder the guy? By the way, just to be clear, I don't believe this report is true. That's the first point. On the second point, though...
If it is true, I'll put it like this: it would be like an extreme escalation.
Yes.
Attacking a military base near our capital
with a suicide bombing would be extreme. That would be extreme. I mean,
hear you.
I
hear you.
And so I have no idea and no belief that Iran would escalate like that, because that hasn't been the policy. Meaning, look, the policy and the politics taking place in the Trump administration understood one main thing. Nobody wanted a war. Trump didn't want a war. Iran didn't want a war. So within the context of that, there's a certain degree of brinksmanship that can take place knowing the other person doesn't want a war. So they can murder Soleimani. They know Iran doesn't want a war. So it's a tit for tat. And you find a way to find a tat. In this case, you hit a military base. You don't believe that the U.S. will go to war for it. Does that make sense? This would be such an extreme escalation that it would basically break that model of politics that's taken place over the last, 4 or 5 years. That's why I don't buy it. It seems utterly absurd to me that they would do something like this when it breaks the model in regards to the logic they've been running with. So yeah, I don't buy it.
No, but it's worth noting that this is a claim. That's I think the headline here. And whether if it's true, that's extremely significant. But if it's not a true claim, if they don't have credible intelligence, but they're nevertheless saying it, that's itself a pretty severe escalation from the United States. If we're accusing another country of planning to engage in this kind of activity, that itself could very easily be taken as a casus belli. Not that I think we want to declare war. Not that I think realistically anybody in this situation actually wants war. What we want is money to keep being spent on weaponry and to keep things tense for a variety of reasons, some of which are still confusing to me. But hey, back to the headlines here. Speaking of tense, the European Union, Britain, Canada, and the United States on Monday launched coordinated sanctions against officials in China over human rights abuses. British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said the measures were part of an intensive diplomacy, quote unquote, by the UK, the United States, Canada, and the 27-nation European Union to force action amid mounting evidence about serious rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim people. China responded immediately to the EU's move, slapping sanctions on 10 European individuals and 4 institutions that it said had damaged China's interests and, quote, maliciously spread lies and disinformation, end quote. Initially, China denied the existence of camps for detaining Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but has since described them as centers to provide job training and to re-educate those exposed to radical jihadi thinking. Officials deny all charges of human rights abuses there. As part of Monday's move, the EU also imposed sanctions over repression in North Korea. Russia's foreign
can I
envoy,
just make
Sergei
a quick
Lavrov's...
point? It'll be very quick. We are teaching China some very bad lessons here. And I don't mean this from the standpoint of we're able to push the policy and push the level of no, I don't mean that. We are looking at the world from a zero-sum point of view. And I honestly believe that China looks at it in this kind of winner-win point of view. The zero-sum beats the win-win. It just does. Because from its standpoint, everything is used as a means of politics. I mean, even the vaccines. And so at some point, it is very possible that China starts appropriating a very similar point of view. And that would be,
I would argue,
disastrous.
It depends on how many players you have. It depends on how many players you have.
Go for it.
I mean, literally, game theoretically, if you have a single zero-sum player, just a couple of them, and you have a bunch of win-win players playing out there, and they actually have reason to think that they're playing win-win. In other words, when they make decisions that mutually benefit each other, then they sort of grow each other's common welfare. Well, then what happens is the country, the zero-sum country or countries tend to lose over time because they're in a sort of naked dog-eat-dog race, and some of the competitions they win, some they lose, but that's where they are. Whereas if you're constantly engaging in positive-sum games, I mean, again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but basically the idea is you boost each other up, and everybody who engages in that to various extents benefits from it, and comparatively, the zero-sum parties might start to lose out. I would say that's actually a pretty fair description of a lot of what we see happening around the globe right now.
I don't know. I mean, because over the last, 50, 60, I mean, you're talking about like American dominance or Western dominance for God knows how long. Britain had basically the entire world, or 50% of the world after the First World War. The United States basically took over from Britain after they jumped the shark in the, the Egypt thing where they jumped.
Suez Crisis.
Yeah, right there. Thank you. But I guess I'm making the point that this has been a Western dominance. I mean, honestly, part and parcel to China's bristling that we're talking about has to do with the way that they were treated, either from the standpoint of Hong Kong or the way that they were treated from the standpoint of the Opium Wars. We treated them in this kind of racist way, and we still continuously do that in the way that we deal with other countries. This assumption that we are somehow better and can make those choices about who lives and who dies, even among their citizenry. I mean, what are your thoughts for that?
I hear you.
What are your thoughts? I mean, it seems that perspective of the world has won out. Will it continue to? I don't know. But up to this point, I would say this, though. I agree with you. If the majority of the world says we're going to do this in a win-win, then you're right. The zero sum can't win in that situation. There's too many players in the game. But if those countries are divided, oh yeah, zero sum wins out. Because it doesn't. Think of Gorbachev, for example. You have a situation where Gorbachev believes fully that there's going to be some kind of coming together for the world, and we're going to have world peace, et cetera, et cetera. It was there. It was at the cusp. And what happens? We use that as an opportunity to dance on the bones of the Soviet Union. And everything that we have at our disposal goes into taking advantage of that situation. His point of view was world harmony and win-win. Our point of view was we're going to win this. And not just win it, we're going to have world domination. We're going to just win it in general. The point of view of zero sum is a different mindset, if that makes sense. But I'm sorry. Go.
100%. No, I'm going to close it here because we're over time by a bit. And we got a guest on the line. You guys have been listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Joel Siegel. See you on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. As we've been having the conversation over the course of the week, and this conversation is probably going to continue because it doesn't necessarily seem like the issues associated with the border are going to be alleviated anytime soon. As we pointed out in the beginning, Donald Trump tries a particular policy of basically preventing people from coming into the country. And like I said, he was the snarling face of stay out. And on top of the snarling face of stay out, you had COVID that also created a disincentive to come. Biden gets in. And I'm just going to read it from the New York Times. And in mid-November, a federal judge ruled that the administration could not expel unaccompanied children. As a result, expulsions of unaccompanied children fell nearly 3,200 in October to 1,528 in November, to just 3 in December and 18 in January. An appeals court stayed that ruling in late January, once again allowing the expulsion of children, but the Biden administration has decided against the practice. Meaning that regardless of Biden screaming to the hilt at the border, don't come, for God's sake, please don't come. Despite that being the policy right now, it is also the policy that if a kid gets there, if they can get past the gangs, if they can get past the drug wars and all of those things, if they can get past the fires and the depravity and the corruption and get that kid to the border, we'll take them. which means that the incentive is to put the kid at the border so that kid to be taken. And when you have COVID and everything else, it creates another difficulty or problem in regards to the spacing and everything else. The question, what is going on behind the scenes from the politics standpoint? We had the conversation with Ted Rall about the immigration issue in and of itself. But what are the politics? Democrats don't seem to want to talk about immigration now. AOC was crying at the border. Now, I think she made like 2 tweets. So discuss the politics of this. We're joined by Joe Siegel, one of my favorite guests. I know I always say that, but former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for the passage of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. He is co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. Joel, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Happy spring. Good morning to 2 of my favorite talk show hosts.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. So there seems to be a problem at the border, a crisis, if I may will.
Right.
And just to play a clip, because I love watching the press conferences on this, because listen to this. This is one of the most inept questions in the world. Hey, do you think that if people saw the border that they would call a crisis a crisis? Let's play the clip real quick.
On Wednesday, who of course will be women, just to give you a little preview, but go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. 2 subject areas. In the spirit of transparency to rebuild public trust, when will reporters be allowed to tour facilities holding children who cross the southern border? And are there any concerns that the images from those tours might show that there's a crisis?
Well, first, we are working to
stop right there for a moment.
finalize details.
Because whatever Jen says, the question is one of the most ludicrous questions in the world. Hey, do you think that if you saw that there was a crisis at the border, that people would call it a crisis at the border? It's so strange. Joel, what is your framing of all this? What is going on behind the scenes in the politics? Because this looks very bad for Democrats, and media is harping on this like nobody's business.
Well, the corporate media is always going to make money off sensationalizing tragedy, right? That's what they're really good at.
1,000%, yes.
Let's have a thoughtful, intellectual, mature adult discussion about this. First of all, the unequal global order, the disparity of wealth between the 1% and the rest of the world, now it's right in our face. So the immigration patterns are driven by 2 things: climate change. You've had these hurricanes in Central America, which devastated farming. It, really created very hard conditions for people to live. So they want to move north so they can have a place to live and, fresh water, not dirty, polluted water. You got gang violence. You have crime. You have corrupt governments. And a lot of this is from the fact there's never been a Marshall Plan of Central America. Biden administration is now talking about getting to the root causes. So it's really hard to blame a president. Biden is to blame. No, you don't see people from Canada coming here because Biden is the president. It's climate change and economic dislocation that we can't even imagine now. Okay, that's what's driving the crisis. So there should be a humanitarian perspective on this and say, well, what do we do with all these people who can't live where they're living because they're being threatened with murder and gang violence, and they can't drink because there's drought also? You got to come up with a policy that is humane, pragmatic, and fair. And that means there has to be a balance between how many people come in here who are allowed to come in, and then when those who do come, how are they treated? But it's got to be done in the most humane way possible. And perfection cannot be the standard here. It's got to be. It's a tragedy. How do we deal with this tragedy so that the kids, aren't treated like they were in the Trump administration? But that's my take on it: is do what's best for the children, but you also have to you can't have a completely open border. I've never met a Democrat, by the way, that is for open borders. That's a Republican trope. That's just completely false. It's just not true.
I won't respond to that because honestly, it's not something I know enough about. But on what the root causes of this are, I thought you brought up a couple of good ones, but one big glaring one that you left out that we like to bring up, and I'm curious about your take on, is U.S. foreign policy in the South. You brought up the Sherman Plan, the idea that we could engage in a Sherman Plan down south to try to repair things. fix things up. Well, the plan that appears to have superseded that and that precedes, any attempt at a Sherman plan by, about a century, a long time, the Monroe Doctrine, where we have effectively taken up the mantle of controlling institutions, governments, the domestic political affairs of the countries to our south, pretty much down to Antarctica. And in the process of taking up that mantle or putting on that hat, we've overthrown a lot of governments. I mean, you say that it's not Biden's fault, and of course, I wouldn't level everything on him, but it was under Obama. It was while Biden was vice president that we overthrew Zelaya down in Honduras. A lot of the migrants we're talking about now are fleeing from Honduras. And certainly it seems that Biden is signing on to Trump's policy of continuing to sanction Venezuela and continuing the heavy-handed American control of the nations of South, Central America, and the Caribbean. It seems like we're still in that rut. And I said something similar myself, that we would do well to consider how we can genuinely aid these countries' political development, economic development, and the basic welfare of the lot of the people who live in those countries. But it seems like that's putting the cart before the horse, because first of all, we should stop overthrowing governments we don't like, who suit our domestic political interests, who don't suit our foreign policy. What's your take on that, Joel?
You should run for Congress. I mean, you just said it all in a very short period of time. You know what? I was trained to solve problems that are very complex. And the way you solve a problem, you bring the best, the brightest people together in a series of conferences, task force rooms, and it's got to be nonpartisan, and you got to include the people who are in that country. You got to include their academics. You got to include their local elected officials, and you got to include the people who are, experiencing the crisis. And you got to come up with a policy that will work and for everybody. And look, to me, Biden, if you look at his new policies, I mean, it's pathway to citizenship, opening doors to refugees, reimagining border security. He's doing some very, very good stuff, I think, that are in alignment with that. But where I agree with you is, I like the word, by the way. Did you say Sherman plan?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, so the Marshall Plan, was when we rebuilt right after.
Thank you. I'm being dumb. Thank you for the correction there.
No, it's okay. So the Marshall Plan was people who were really pretty smart after World War II realized that if you maintain depression-like economics in Germany and Japan, they learned from after World War I, authoritarian dictatorships and strongmen usually arise when there's economic disparities and dislocation, a lot of people out of work. They realized that from knowing that, Hitler and the fascists in Japan really came out of the Depression. So they were like, okay, let's create a middle class there. They created a middle class there. And guess what? They became stabilized countries. If you don't have a middle class, I don't care what country it's in, there's going to be destabilization. So until we get a middle class in Central America, we're not going to stop this flow of refugees. Until we quit burning fossil fuels and, heating the atmosphere and creating hurricane conditions. I'm sorry, but climate change is real. I'm sorry, but science and physics don't change over time. There's going to be continued drought. So you got to, have an immigration policy, but you got to get to the root causes of the immigration. And that's, oppression of masses of people so the 1% can make money in those countries. In the United States and Europe, I think, and Canada have to come up with a policy to build a middle class there. That's all there is to it. And until we do those things, we're not going to change this problem. I haven't heard one person on MSNBC or CNN go into the root causes of this. They start, it becomes a political football. Well, it's Trump's fault. It's Biden's fault. Look, it's a problem. Just solve it, man. Just solve the problem.
Yeah, they just throw it. It's like the boundaries of the conversation only go so far. It's very strange. As watching the press conferences, it's very weird. They would say, hey, there's a crisis at the border. And Psaki would respond. And they say, but what is Biden going to do with the crisis at the border? And somebody else would respond. Somebody else might say, hey, they're putting these illegal people in hotel rooms. What do you say about that? How do you justify that? But the boundaries of the conversation only go from there's a problem at the border to what is Biden going to do about it? never beyond those boundaries, meaning this notion of trying to get to the core in a contextual way is off the table from the standpoint of the American audience. Meaning, how could the political space ever get to the point of answering or solving those questions if indeed, from the standpoint of media, the context is always dropped in regards to the reasons for it? That's the part that always leaves me with this notion of how do they expect to solve it, which gets me to the point of thinking they don't expect to solve it, they don't want to solve it. What are your thoughts? I mean, why? You've been in politics long enough. I've always asked, are they incompetent or are they doing this intentionally? Which one is it?
It's a very good question. Combination of both. Most of the Hill, the Congress, and the White House staff-driven. If you have really good staff that are competent technically, they know their policy, they have a heart, they have compassion, they have empathy, then you can solve a lot of these problems. When I came to Congress, I wanted universal health care, I wanted to end homelessness. I'd experienced all those conditions. So there was a small percentage of members of Congress or members of the White House team that I really felt wanted to solve problems. But they were significant enough where they had a bully pulpit to solve those problems. I'll give you an example, AOC. AOC right now, and the Squad and the Progressive Caucus, the Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus, it's called the Quad Caucus and the Asian Pacific American Caucus, could wield their power right now, start hearings and briefings on this issue, and then go meet with Biden and say, all right, this is the policy that we would like to talk with you about, and then go ahead and implement it. That's what I did when I was in Congress. I utilized Mr. Conyers' chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee. I utilized all my contacts on the Hill, and we got a lot of great things done. I even negotiated with the Bush administration. I was the architect of the PEPFAR, the global aid, the passage of that bill, because I had a lot of members of Congress and staff, and I brought in Bono and went to Bush and said, hey, man, $15 billion to stop global AIDS pandemic, and we got it done. So whenever people tell me, oh, you can't get anything done on the Hill, there's all this politics, that was not my experience. You just got to organize and have a heart and just try your best, and the universe would work itself out. Same thing can happen here with immigration.
Very interesting.
It should not be a political football. Yeah, it should not be a football.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, it shouldn't. Well, it shouldn't. No, it shouldn't be a football. In the context of just human beings, and in the context of not using the pain and suffering of human beings for their own political expedience. No, it's so craven, and it's so, I don't know, it's unempathetic. It's people at the worst ends of society basically being used entirely, like their pain being mined entirely for political expedience. And it is a grotesque thing that we're watching. I want to get into this notion of the ability to get stuff done and why those things don't get done. And I even kind of want to hit the $15 minimum wage on this before going to this, because if it is indeed possible for them to get stuff done, why not that? The president said he wanted it. Why not that? And is this the president's purview? They know that the president has a certain perspective of this stuff, even with immigration. And what is the answer to the border crisis? You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice that you guys were listening to is Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, and one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. He is co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we are talking about the politics of immigration. Beforehand with Jamarl, we had a conversation about immigration in and of itself and the effects of it. But right now, we're getting into the politics with one Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer. Well, I think I actually read that already. I think I'm having a brain fart. I'm sorry. Joel, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Absolutely. All right. So one of the things I want to get into, you mentioned something really interesting in the last segment. You mentioned this notion of wielding power and how you were able to bring people together and push for the various interests in order to get power. And of course, this is going to depend largely on what is politically feasible with the various parties. If it's something that they can hit in a nonpartisan way that looks good for them, they probably will be more willing to do it. I think for bigger lifts, it's probably a little bit more difficult to pull off. What is the path for the immigration thing? And is there a middle ground that can be thread in order for Biden to get the votes on this issue? And for that matter, what is Biden trying to accomplish on this issue? One last point. The $15 an hour minimum wage. Why not put it back into the bill if they were legitimately for it? Meaning the president said he wanted it. The progressives said they wanted it. They put it into the bill. Joe Manchin kicks food out of the mouths of babies just to put a knife in workers to take that out. And they just leave it and just go with it. If they really were for the $15 an hour minimum wage, I don't know if we talked about this, but if they were for it, why not push for it? It seems like they have the higher leverage in that sense since Biden said he was for it. It's very strange to me. And in the same way that they can use power for that, what is the gameplay for this?
You guys are really good. These questions are just so thoughtful. Excellent questions. I'll take the $15 minimum wage issue first. So the $15 minimum wage was in the COVID-19 Relief Act. Joe Manchin said, I'm not supporting this. If you put that in there, I'm not going to vote for it. And so they took it out. And it needs to be reintroduced. But when you reintroduce a bill like the $15 minimum wage, when Mr. Conyers hired me, he said, I think it was my first day on the job, he said, why didn't Hillary care? The Hillary Clinton's universal health care bill. How come it didn't get passed? I said, because there was no grassroots movement to get it passed. So the $15 minimum wage, it sounds like it's not controversial. It really is, because the small business community is very powerful in Congress, and they're going to say, look, it's COVID-19. We can't keep our doors open. If you I have to pay $15 minimum wage right now, I'm going to, go bankrupt. And what they need to do right now, if I was the Biden administration, I would begin hearings in Congress on the $15 minimum wage, and I would really make sure that they're aired on television and get the truth out. Can we afford? I would say the answer is probably yes, but there's a way to do it where you could do it in phases, and I'll just give you an example. One phase would be, we're going to phase in $15 minimum wage in the next year. If you make X amount of dollars, you're Fortune 500, you're going to have to do $15 an hour. If your aggregate, profit margin is X, then you're going to go $15 an hour. If you're below that, we're going to do like some kind of a phase in, but it can't be like 5 years. I think it needs to be like maybe a year or 2 year phase in. You have to build grassroots support. You've got to get in the media before you go $15 an hour. You can't have a small movement. You got to go big. And that hasn't been done yet. So the grassroots got to do that. Members of Congress got to do their job, and they got to work together.
Joe, real quick, just to intercede before we go to the next part. Joe Biden told me that $15 an hour and less than that was a starvation wage, that people couldn't eat, couldn't feed themselves on that wage. As a candidate, he was on stage and he pushed back against Donald Trump when Donald Trump was making the point about 15. Joe Biden says, no, these heroes, they need to get the $15 an hour. Anything less is a starvation wage. He kept saying it. Democrats kept saying it. COVID comes and 5,000 people die a day. And those people who are out there at those stores making sure we get food, who are delivering our food in Grubhub, who are delivering our groceries, those people were called heroes. And they said it is unjust, morally and ethically, for those heroes to go on a starvation wage. And now, with the vaccine is in, the deaths are under 1,000. They don't matter anymore. I'm saying that is ungodly. There's something grotesquely wrong with that, morally and ethically, that we're going to allow people to basically live on what the president has said is a starvation wage. And I would make the case that I get it that it's from a small business standpoint, that it is treacherous. But it is something, like you say, that can be issued in phases. I guess I'm making the argument that from the standpoint of the people who were there, who were putting themselves on the line, it is owed. It is almost, you can call it a reparations. It is one of those things that we should not, those people stood there and put their bodies on the line for us. And then the moment that the deaths go down and things go back to normal, 500,000 people died for a large share of the poor. Those people who are not making $15,000 that money. And by the way, 42% of the public was making $18,000 or less. That is astonishing. And so it's like those people basically die for us. And at the end of it, thanks, let's go back to normal. You don't see something morally and ethically wrong with that?
Yeah, I do. I think you're right. I think what Biden do, especially it was black workers, especially black women who work minimum wage at Burger King and McDonald's and Target, who got him elected. So the reparations analogy also is very apropos. And the least that Biden can do to say, thank you, black people who got me elected. You voted for me. A lot of you are living off starvation wages. I'm making a commitment to you and everybody else. We're going to get to $15, and here's how we're going to do it. So yes, he does have a moral obligation to be strong about that, no matter where he goes, everywhere he talks. Otherwise, the appearance is exactly what you said. You're not sincere about it. You don't care about us. You used us, and what are we getting for the fact that we voted for you? So I think you're on target with that.
It sounds like you're saying that he jumped the gun. So I'm sorry for cutting in there. There was a break. It sounds like you're saying that Biden jumped the gun slightly. If what he would have needed to do, if he genuinely wanted this, would have been to build up a grassroots network, to build up bottom-up support, to get Congress on board, to get the preemptive buy-in from the public and from Congress before he went through with it. It sounds like you're saying he jumped the gun, as politicians more or less characteristically do as they make promises, in the lead up to an election. Is that I want to come back to immigration because there is a connection here, but is that broadly right, Joel?
A little bit different. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I think it was good for Biden to come out for the $15 minimum wage. I think it was good that they put it in the bill. It had to be taken out. So what happened was a $15 minimum wage has been raised to priority status due to Biden coming out for it, due to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party coming out for it. That's the hardest thing to do in politics, is take an issue that's off the radar screen and not really popular. They did their job. Now it's up to the people to demand passage of that $15 minimum wage, demand that the Democrats pass it and that Biden prioritize it. But I think now it's just a matter of grassroots organizing to get it passed. It has to be reintroduced as a standalone.
I'm guessing the sense from a lot of people is they feel like if you were in support of it, or if you're somebody who could have been bought over, or not bought over, but could have been won over, and you got excited by it. I'm guessing a lot of people are looking at Biden with some dejection and derision, and they're not feeling like he would stand up if they were to call on him for it. I don't see the pressure being there. What's your take, Joel?
I think people understand that Biden's, only been president for a few months. He's dealing with COVID-19. He's dealing with the immigration crisis. He's dealing with all these, an economy that's failing, millions about to be evicted. I think they kind of have a little bit of compassion for now. I don't know how long that'll last for.
That's not fair, Joe. That's not fair at all.
This is the first year of his presidency. This is the year in which he should be doing this stuff. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, that's not fair, Joe. I mean, you're giving him a huge break on this one. I mean, at the end of the day, the president of the United States, he was going to do something. He was for it. The country gave him the power to do it with a mandate They were able to even give him Democrats in Georgia in an election that I don't think Democrats ever want to run off election in Georgia. He said, give me the power and I'll do it. They gave him the power to do it, and he let them down. He didn't even push. I guess I don't like this notion that now we need the public to get on board for it and get Joe Biden to do something that he full-throatedly told him he was going to do. He is not getting a pass from me on that, nor should he get a pass from the public. They should be apoplectic over that.
No. I agree with you. I'm not saying for me, I'm not going to give him a pass. I'm just saying that what was asked was, are people going to view Biden with derision and cynicism? My response is right now I don't think that they are. However, if he does not rebound right now, if he does not make that commitment full-throated and say we're going to pass the $15 minimum wage, I ran on it, then I would agree with your analysis. He might have like a little bit of a pass right now, but he better double down, or what you're saying is correct. There will be cynicism, derision, dejection. That's all I'm saying. I wouldn't give him the pass myself. I was just saying that's what I think the public said.
It may be ramping up, and maybe it's just the circles that we travel in or something. But I've seen plenty of that. I've seen little of people giving him the benefit of the doubt. But again, I'm probably not a part of a representative sample of the broader political American public. Anyway, another example, and I want to come back to immigration here for just a minute before we close out this segment. Another example of Biden undercutting himself, I would say, is on immigration, where he didn't technically promise, he wasn't promising open borders, but the implication during the primaries and in the first couple of months of his presidency was he would swing far in the other direction from Trump. Trump was, among other things, the anti-immigration president, even the anti-immigrant president. Biden tried hard, I would say, to set the tone that he would, as in many cases with Trump, push far in the opposite direction and sort of correct the sins of the previous administration. And in the process, I would argue he set himself up for the crisis that the migrants are now living, which is there's this implication or tacit promise, tacit commitment to handle immigrants, bring people in more effectively, give them treatment they need, that kind of thing. And I would argue that's what set a lot of people coming up here. And I would, a sort of second order, less important, is the political consequences, which he set himself up for a political crisis domestically, but first and foremost is the humanitarian crisis we're seeing to our south. We've got to close here in a minute, but Joel, what's your take on that idea?
I think Biden did the right thing. He distinguished himself from Trump. He got in there. He's passed incredible executive orders that everyone should go and Google, your listening audience, Joe Biden immigration policy, and just look at what he's doing. It's progressive. I think it's the right thing for the right time. No, I can't blame Biden for anything. I can't blame him for climate change induced drought, climate immigrants, poverty, war, gangs. I can't blame him for that. What I can say is he's on the right track. It's just that we have to come together as a nation and also in Central America and come up, including, got to bring in Mexico, come up with a fair, rational, humane policy. And I think Biden is the better person to do that, not Trump, who called immigrants, rapists, and joining gangs and building walls that never work. I'll take Biden over Trump any day on immigration policy. He was a fascist, a racist, and a nativist. And we have a Statue of Liberty. We got to live by it. That's why we have Statue of Liberty.
All right, fair enough. More topics for another time, because we can definitely have a fun conversation and even argument about a lot of that. But Joel, I really appreciate you joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
Hey, thank you. For those listening, that was Joel Siegel, former congressional staffer, co-author of H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All bill, also one of the leading architects for passage of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. He is also co-founder and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network, that's JAM, a nationwide multiracial climate action network. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and we'll be back with the last segment of today's show, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. See you again in just a minute.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are in the wrap segment for today's show. That means we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We've got a caller on the line and we've got room for more. So again, 202-521-1320. Let's go to Cynthia calling in from Maryland. Cynthia, you're on. What's going on?
Talk to your guest. However, they know good well Biden has Alzheimer's or dementia. And if they really wanted to run with him, they medicated this man up. Come on, y'all, this is elderly abuse. Everybody knows it, and they knew it, but they stuck the man in to run for president because Obama said to vote for Biden.
Actually, Obama didn't want Biden to run. And that was one of those things that came out early, that Obama was not necessarily on board. If you remember, none of them wanted Biden. Biden just so happened was the person who could sop up the black vote. And so when it came to week after week, if you remember, there were like 20-something people in the race. That was because Democrats had no clue on who they wanted. They just knew it wasn't Sanders. And if we're honest, they didn't want it to be Biden. What I think is Kamala Harris was greatly unliked by the black community. They thought she would be able to get more support from the African-American community. Not so much. They didn't like her. K-Hive was ridiculous and still is. And so how do you get her, who's basically the Clinton wing of the party, into office when she is remarkably unlike? I know Joe Biden is at the end of his years, the twilight of his years. Put him in office and put her as the vice president. The vice president is a non-factor one way or the other, usually when a candidate is running, especially like Biden. And if anything happens to Biden from the standpoint of illness, let's say he fell down those steps and hit his head, Kamala Harris becomes president. They get what they want. I think it's that cynical in regards to politics, and I think Biden is in on it. I don't think he would be shocked by it at all. It's continuity on the inside with a change in person and female genitalia on the outside. So, what are your thoughts, Shane? Am I being, too involved in the machinations that I think are taking place within Democratic headquarters? I do believe they wanted Kamala Harris, and I do believe this was the way of getting her in without being elected.
Yeah, I think that she was a good candidate for them. But correct me if I'm misremembering, but wasn't Biden consistent? You're right. He was consistently portrayed against Bernie Sanders as the more electable candidate, the dude with proven political experience, many decades in Congress, last vice president, before Pence, during Obama's terms. Wasn't that the idea?
It was, but that was after everybody collapsed. That was like when Buttigieg, Klobuchar, all of them just jumped out the race. Elizabeth Warren started taking money from a super PAC, and then to get into the last race. Like that was at that point where all of that stuff was at Super Tuesday and those type of things. But up to that point, 20 people were in the race, and none of them wanted to say. I mean, if you remember, they were even talking about Cuomo. Bloomberg jumps into the race because Bloomberg doesn't believe Joe Biden can carry the burden. Like all of this stuff was taking place. And they were like, maybe Cuomo will get in. You had polling that started adding Cuomo to the polling. And it was polling higher than Joe Biden. Do you remember this? Like this was when like Cuomo was giving his briefings and everything else. And they were like, he seems presidential. Because they didn't want Joe Biden. Meaning they know. They can see him just like everybody else. You can play a clip from Biden 10 years ago. He is a different man. They know it. They're not that stupid. They just don't say. And in their heads, I do think they thought he's the only one that can sop up the black vote. It's either him or Sanders. And in their heads, it was never going to be Sanders. In that book, I can't remember the name of that book, but they made the point, Lucky, I think that's the name of it, where they were talking about how Biden stumbled his way into the White House. And you had this thing where they're talking about in the book how Democrats like the upper echelon, didn't know whether or not they were going to support Sanders or Trump if it came down to it. Think about that. He's running in the Democratic Party. He's backed Democrats all the way through. And when it came down to it, they were like, yeah, thanks for backing us, but yeah, no, this is where we get off. Meaning it didn't go both ways. But to me, I don't have a belief that it does go both ways. I assume they would do that. Sanders doesn't. And that's the sad part. Yeah, they weren't going to back him. They weren't going to back him.
I hear you. We got more callers. We could keep that going, but we have two more callers on the line. Let's go to Nate from Atlanta. Nate, you're on the air. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, how you doing? Yes, one was about the you were talking about the us working with with the nations that's committing genocide, and you were talking about Nazi Germany, and we on record, a lot of our U.S. companies were working along with Nazi Germany, and was allowed permission through I think FDR to keep working in Nazi Germany throughout the war. And on the second point, when you were talking about the breakaway civilization, there's a very interesting theory that Nazi Germany was very advanced technology, was working on anti-gravity flying machines that looked like flying saucers in a way, and fled to Antarctica after they lost the war. But
yeah, you're talking about like the Nazi Bell. Yeah, but there's nothing to back that up, as far as I know. I haven't seen the ship. I haven't seen anything to back it up. As far as I know, Hitler died in that bunker. It was set on fire. Stalin got the body and didn't tell anybody for decades. Look, I don't know if the FDR thing is true. I do know there were some companies that were working with Nazi Germany. I have a hard time believing that they were given the express consent of FDR, considering at that point the war was a scorched earth war where there was no, I have a hard time believing that they would say, yes, we're at this war of annihilation. However, we're totally going to allow our companies to work with the enemy and killing our troops. I don't buy that. Not FDR. What do you think, Shane?
I don't buy that too. I wouldn't doubt it in the lead up to the war and even in the earlier stages before the United States gets involved. And I've heard that certainly, but I never looked into it too much. So I'm not going to speak from a position of authority here. But like Jamarl said, while the war is ongoing after the United States has entered into it, that seems doubtful to me. That seems like it would be a terrible political move on the part of FDR. And if it was happening, I seriously doubt that it was happening with his permission, but I wouldn't even give it the benefit of the doubt until I, see more on it. I wouldn't assume it before I know more about it. We got more calls though. Nate, thanks for the call. We got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's going on, guys? You guys have definitely hammered this in when you were talking to Joe, but I just have to further it. The statement that one, he would rather have Biden than Trump. I think that's just a horrible stance. I know that a lot of people clearly take that same view, but we all of us who follow these things, who follow headlines, who follow politics, who follow policy, most importantly, realize that there's really no difference other than one's a little bit older, a little less in control of his faculties, and somewhat more polite, I guess, and doesn't tweet as much. But other than that, it's all the same policies and all the same lack of action on the behalf of the American people, like as they like to use as a shield. It's just a horrible stance to take. And then when he says we have to get together a grassroots movement, we just had an election. People came out in the midst of a pandemic to vote out the prior president, to vote in this president under the belief that they were going to get the things that he ran on, just totally cast into the wind the every bit of history that we know that these politicians lie constantly, and they never do what they say they're going to do once they're in office. We just totally cast it to the wind. Well, I didn't, but they just totally cast it to the wind and vote this guy in on the grounds of getting a $2,000 check, on the grounds of getting a $15 an hour minimum wage over the course of 4 to 5 years. Even when Joe said, even when he says it would have to be something, it would be a smarter way of doing it, bringing it in incrementally. Well, that's what it was going to be, and that was an
right.
Right. One. So, I mean, who is he? It's just frustrating, man. I mean, I can't say anything more than that. It's frustrating. I mean, I literally feel like the media, the jerks in Washington, the forever state in Washington, the intelligence agencies. I literally feel like this government that we have in place around us is popping a wheelie on us and putting their thumbs in our faces, letting us know that we are doing what we want to do because we have got you people. We've got you little monkeys trained to not
Brave,
want anything.
Brave. We've got to close it out, but I want to let you know, behind the scenes, really, it's just Jamarl's YouTube channel. He's been clapping for like the past 2.5 minutes straight. I mean, there's a lot there to agree with. I don't have enough time to respond fully, but I appreciate the call, Brave. We got to close today's show out. I want to say thank you to all of our guests. Great show so far. Thank you to all of our callers. Thank you, Andre, our engineer. Thank you, Mary T, our producer. And thank you, that is you, for listening to the show. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Signing off. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Yeah, I was clapping for Brave because I felt the same way. Like, it was infuriating, and I'm trying to allow people to get their points out without jumping in. And so as Joel is talking, I'm like, just keep it in, just keep it in, just keep it in. And it's like, we just had an election. It was a mandate. And not just a mandate, you had all the power to do everything that you wanted to do, and you didn't do it. And so it's like, am I really going to put that on the American public and say, hey, you guys now need to have this other hurdle to get over in order to give Joe Biden a pass? Not giving him a pass on that. That was the entire point of the election, that this person was getting in office and he said explicitly, I am going to do X. And then to make the argument that, well, Joe Manchin took it out. So what? Put it back in. Joe Manchin doesn't have any special powers that the House of Representatives doesn't have in the context of who gets more right to put something or out of a bill. Are you kidding me? So yeah, it's a failure. It's not just a failure, it's an abdication. It's an outright lie. And I don't even believe he meant it in the beginning at this point. It was a dodge. He basically sold the public a bill of goods. Here, $15 an hour minimum wage. My mom raised me on less than that. I'm telling you this from personal perspective of how diminutive, how little, how everything become a crisis when you are on a starvation wage. She had to raise a kid on that. She has to raise a sick kid on that. And so when I'm making this argument, or my angst, or my bitter enderness on this is coming from direct personal experience of growing up with a parent that had to raise a kid with that. And I know as a flat fact, there are millions of us just like that. 42% of the population made less than $18,000 a year. My mom being one of them. And so when I make this point, it's from personal experience. And I'm making this point that we call those people heroes. They were out there day after day on those shopping lines, putting their life at risk. And you can make the argument that, well, they did it because they had to feed their kids. Does that make it any less of them putting their life at risk, even if a society was set up in a way that it forced them to put their life on the line to feed their family and feed their kids? That's the point that I'm trying to make here. We call them heroes when 5,000 people were dying a day. And the moment that came where the numbers dropped them. They're not heroes anymore. They're something else. And as such, we don't have to follow through on the $15 an hour. And by the way, to make that worse, to use the stimulus as a way of sliding past the $15 an hour. Hey, the stimulus was passed. Let's not pay attention. Don't say anything about 15. Let's just move on to, immigration. It's a big deal. It's a big fucking deal. We're talking about people who are living at the margins of society, who go out and work every day. You have a company that is basically open, that is basically having those workers working at a capacity that they can't feed themselves. If a worker is going to open a shop, meaning if an employer is going to open a shop, then by the least that they can do from some kind of societal contract is paying a person a decent wage for their labor. Why is it that the Democratic Party and Joe Biden believes that workers are so undeserving of $15 an hour? That's the question. Democrats had the power. They chose not to use it. Biden had the power. He chose not to use it. And at this point, there are no excuses. And so, yeah, Brave, I feel you, man. That was an aggravating conversation, because I just kept thinking it was an election. He just got elected. Georgia put a Democrat in office. That is mind-blowing. Georgia put 2 Democrats in runoff elections for the first time ever. That is phenomenal. And now they put him in there so he can do exactly what he said he was going to do. And what did he do? He didn't do it. He left him in the lurch. He had the power to get rid of student debt, $50,000, if not all of it. He had the power to pass that $15 an hour, to put his foot in Joe Manchin's ass. He chose not to do it. 500,000 people have died. This is not normal politics. And yet, they're pretending that it is. Put that in context. 500,000 Americans were extinguished over the course of a year. It wasn't a war. We weren't bombed. In fact, we lost more people in this year than wars. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, all because the U.S. and the government of that U.S. rank in competence and honestly caring more about their bottom line, more about the dollars, more about the companies and the businesses. And Joe Biden continued that, caring more about the companies and the businesses, and basically working for or basically not passing the $15 an hour minimum wage. Yeah, it's aggravating. We owe the public phenomenal. I mean, I'm talking about this class of workers. We pretend like they don't exist. We pretend like it's okay that they get these shitty wages or these gig economies. And we act as if that's perfectly okay. They're invisible in our society. They're the worker class in our society. And when it came to the chance of ensuring that they had some level of leveling, fuck them over. Like, share, subscribe. They shouldn't get a pass over that. And people, I'm sorry, the American public should be apoplectic over that. But I'm going to end it here. Wait, somebody sent a thing. So let me get this in. I'm going to bail out. I have to get Shane up on the thing. You guys are going to see me a little bit later for a few shows. Today is going to be a weird day, and I'm not quite sure I'm going to make this day work. Look, by the way, I didn't know this, but there's been a great depreciation in my subscribers and in views. Now, I thought that was just me. And my thought was, okay, well, when they shut your channel down, it may take a while to get up and running, and your likes are 20%, which is typically it's 10%, so 20% makes it mean you're doing well, meaning the video that's being done is received being extremely well by the public. By the same token, it's a limit on it. Well, apparently, Cal was experiencing something like that. I think it's like 50-60% drop. Convo Couch, many of the other channels were taking the hits also. So apparently, it's not just me. It's something that these guys are doing that is adversely affecting our thing. So, and I'm going to show you guys something else before I leave. You're going to love this. You're going to love this. All right. And we have True Detective. Thank you, True Detective. I appreciate that. Leave a comment, though. Leave a comment. All right. So you guys have seen this. So, like I said, for my UFO segments, I have a new intro. All right, so this. All right, so this is one intro for the segment. So think of it this way. Under normal circumstances, I say, welcome to this, my name is Jamarl Thomas, this is Progressive Soapbox, etc., etc. And beforehand, I give a little intro. But for UFO segments, it's the same. And my thought was I wanted to have a intermediary between those two things that denotes that it's a UFO segment. So, for example, I was talking about Dan Ratcliffe, and I kind of give an intro about Maria Bartiromo, and we're having a clip, etc., etc. The world is great, and then I say, welcome to the Soapbox and this place. Hey, I'm here at Mount Shasta. We're at the UFO convention. We're skywatching at this point, hoping to see something. Keep your eyes peeled. All right. Now, there's a part 2 to that. And the reason that I got a part 2 to that, because I laughed my ass off so hard at the part 1. And yeah, I laughed my ass off so hard at the part 1. So this is part 2. And she just finished this like a couple of days ago. Now, part 2 is basically, think of it in the same thing. The first one has gone, so that's the first scene. And the next time I do a UFO thing, it flips to this. The funniest thing in the world, the alien that's sitting to the far right, he's like shocked by the whole thing. I love that. Because the first time around, she had me like in a gown, and I was like, yeah, fuck that. You're not having anything put into my ass, or even the pretending that someone was putting into my ass in regards to being on the show. If they're bringing me up because they want me to do the news. They want me to do the news. Sitting on the moon looking at events. All right, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks all. Bye-bye.